Hey everybody, this is the postscript to Althusser, The Detour of Theory by Gregory Elliot. The postscript is titled The Necessity of Contingency, and it's dedicated to a Michael Sprinker, who lived from 1950 to 1999. Quote, "We do not publish our own drafts, that is our own mistakes, but we do sometimes publish other people's," end quote. Althusser. Section 1, Althusser after Althusserianism. Intellectually quasi-non-existent either side of the channel following the murder of his wife in November 1980, Louis Althusser was physically interred a decade later. Commenting in 1994, however, David Macy could report that, quote, "the death of the philosopher has led to a resurrection of his writings," end quote. David Macy. The 1990s were indeed marked by a quite unexpected revival of interest in Althusser. The main spur to this raising of the dead was the simultaneous appearance in France in 1992 of his autobiography and the first installment of a biography. These revealed the existence of a hitherto unknown Althusser, something of whose complexity is disclosed by the subsequent volumes in a posthumous edition of his work, completed in 1998. And this is to omit from the reckoning the philosopher's extensive archives, containing some book-length manuscripts, which researchers have begun to delve into, but which have doubtless yet to deliver up all their secrets. What does the posthumous edition comprise? In sum, 9 volumes drawn from the archives deposited at the Institut Mémoire de l'Édition Contemporaine, with after Althusser's death, mostly published by Éditions Stock in conjunction with IMEC, and individually or jointly edited by Olivier Courpey, Yann Moulier-Boutang, and François Mathurin. They may be classified as follows. 1. 2 volumes of autobiographical writings issued in 1992, the 2 memoirs of 1985/1976, presented in L'Avenir de long terme, suivi de les faits, and the prison camp notebooks and correspondence, 1940 to 45, assembled in Journal de Captivité, an expanded version of L'Avenir, featuring other autobiographical texts as well as 3 chapters removed by Althusser from his, quote, confessions, was put together in 1994. An English translation of the first edition had been marketed in the UK by Chatto and Windus the year before. Unaccountably, its U.S. counterpart renders the Gaullist obiter dictum of Althusser's title, "The Future Lasts Forever." 2. 2 volumes of psychoanalytical writings, écrits sur la psychanalyse, from correspondence with Jacques Lacan, 1963 to 66, through to Althusser's interventions in the controversy over the dissolution of the École Freudienne de Paris, 1980, published in 1993, and Psychoanalyse et Sciences Humaines, the edited transcripts of 2 seminar presentations from 1963 to 64, released in 1996. An abridged English edition of the Écrits came out from Columbia the same year as the seminars. 3. 4 volumes of philosophical and political texts. The first, Écrits philosophiques et politiques, 1, 1994, retrieved the bulk of Althusser's, quote, early writings, end quote, 1946 to 50, translated by Verso in 1997 as the book The Spectre of Hegel, an unfinished manuscript on, quote, Marx in His Limits of 1978, due to appear in English in 2006 in a Verso edition of the later writings. The book Philosophy of the Encounter, which I have the introduction to that book on this channel, and extracts from the late Althusserian speculations as to the article as to a, quote, underground current of the materialism of the encounter, end quote, of 1982. Likewise scheduled for inclusion in that volume, the second, entitled Sur la philosophie, 1994, collects written, quote, interviews and correspondence with Fernanda Navarro, 1984 to 87, ruminating on the, quote, aleatory materialism, end quote, mooted in 1982, which will figure in the upcoming Verso collection. A third volume, Sur la reproduction, of 1995, is composed of the unpublished 1969 book on the quote, reproduction of the relations of production, on the article, reproduction of the relations of production. Sorry, it's like using quotes like titles of things to like satisfy a function in the sentence, so it's hard to say what's being, but that's a title of a thing. A third volume, Sur la reproduction, 1995, is composed of the unpublished 1969 book on, quote, the reproduction of the relations of production, which is a title of an article, from which the ideological state apparatuses essay was extracted the following year, together with that article and a retrospective note of 1976, a further offering of Écrits philosophiques et politiques, 1995, arranged thematically, selects diverse material from 1962 to 67, in particular unfinished works on Feuerbach and the Humanist Controversy, which is an article of 1967, text related to the article Philosophy Course for Scientists of 1967 to 68, and an opuscule on Machiavelli derived from a lecture course given in 1972. Machiavel et nous was issued as a separate volume in English by Verso in 1999, with the text from the 1960s, together with a programmatic piece on the, quote, historic task of Marxist philosophy, unquote, an article of 1967, hitherto available only in Hungarian, and the article Three Notes on the Theory of Discourses of 1966, excluded from the book Writings on Psychoanalysis, were translated by Verso in 2003 in the book The Humanist Controversy and Other Writings. Section 4. I don't know why I said section 4. An 800-page collection of Althusser's correspondence with his sometime Italian lover and translator Franca Madonia, Lettres à France, 1961 to 1973, which ranges far beyond an epistolary romance published in 1998. At time of writing, there would appear to be no plans to translate any of this material. So much by way of rudimentary inventory of French publication and English translation. It is also worth mentioning that, under the stimulus of this ambitious program, there were several issues in France. In 1996, Presse Universitaire de France published a Veriorum edition of Lire la Capitale, regrouping the four installments of the second edition, 1968 to 73, in the order of the two-volume original, 1965. Later the same year, Edition Les Découvertes reprinted the book Pour Marx, or For Marx, with a preface and biographical note by Etienne Balibar. Finally, in 1998, Yves Saint-Omer's collection of out-of-print material from 1955 to 77, virtually all of it translated into English at some stage, appeared from Presse Universitaire de France. As for the secondary literature, by the early 1990s, the existing syntheses of Althusser's thought, whether in French, Karsh and Cotton, or English, Kalinikos, Benton, Smith, etc., were out of print. Apart from the occasional contribution, especially by Antonio Negri, the four collections published in English in the course of the decade by Econ Copland and Michael Sprinker, by myself, by Jacques Lesra, and by Antonio Calari and David Ruccio, either effectively predated the posthumous edition or focused their attention elsewhere. The same was true of two full-length studies by Robert Paul Resch and Margaret Mujumdar, and of two earlier French texts, one grouping Balibar's various writings on Althusser, the other the proceeding of a conference held in Paris shortly after the philosopher's death, edited by Sylvain Lazarus. Writing about Althusser gathered new impetus with the publication of L'Avenir de Longtemps and Volume 1 of Molière-Boutang's Louis Althusser. In addition to special issues of Magazine Littéraire and Futur Antérieur in 1992 and 1993, respectively, two substantial volumes of conference papers edited by François Mathurin and Pierre Ramon appeared in French in 1997. In 1999, in response to the flurry of Althusseriana, an expanded edition of the 1974 Trotskyist anthology, Althusser, was put out, featuring at least one markedly less hostile new text by Daniel Ben Said. Again, I believe Daniel Ben Said was on the center, I guess, or maybe, I don't know if I necessarily say the right, but the center of Trotskyism. Definitely not even approaching Tony Cliff in terms of his relation to Stalinism. The same year, two ex-pupils, Pierre Machuret and Dominique Lecourt, supplied intriguing insights into the collective adventure of Althusserianism. From 2000 onwards, an important literature on the late Althusser began to emerge, especially with articles by André Tossel in French, Walt Zuchting Suchting in English, and Vittorio Morfino in Italian. The last of these only one instance of a flourishing culture of publications on and by Althusser in Italy, sponsored by the Associazione e Louis Althusser, directed by Maria Turchetto. In the Anglophone world, meanwhile, although on Andrew Levine's book, A Future for Marxism, Althusser, the analytical turn in the revival of socialist theory, did not redeem the promise of its title. Warren Montag's concise and illuminating book, Althusser, the previous year was the first account in English to register the full impact of the posthumous edition in Althusser studies. A forthcoming translation of Mikko Latinen's Finnish book in the same series as these pages is set to be, the first to take its full measure. Geoffrey Goshgarian's introductions to the book, The Humanist Controversy, and Philosophy of the Encounter are the initial impressive fruits of intensive research in the archives. Before engaging with the unknown Althusser, some quote directions for use and quote are in order. Although on occasion Althusser himself seems to have envisaged a quote posthumous works and correspondence and quote, at other times he expressed misgivings over the phenomenon. Thus, at 2 points, separated by an interval of 15 years, Althusser regretted that Marx's consignment of such drafts as The German Ideology to his bottom drawer, plus Resident Mice, had not been accorded due respect by editors and commentators. Since the bulk of Marx's writings remain unpublished at his death, the paradoxical effect of any consistent application of the implied editorial etiquette would, of course, have been to deprive posterity of precisely those works of Marxian maturity that Althusser counterposed to Marx's early writings. In Althusser's own case, while it would have drawn a veil over the quote, autobiographical hallucination quote, of L'avenir de long terme, that quote, plea indictment confession ... composed for an imaginary tribunal quote, Althusser, it would not have exempted another draft, manifestly destined for posthumous publication, which was unquestionably no mistake or outtake. The book Machiavelli and Us. Actually, I don't know if that past quote that I just said is from Althusser, so don't be cautious. Accordingly, if we would do well to heed Gramsci's cautions about the status of quote posthumous works and quote, handle Althusser's with a care conspicuous by its absence in the Shanghaiing of Althusser's quote self-analysis, by disobliging critics to depict the philosophical political history in which he was a subject as a deranged process with a murderous telos, and bear in mind that these materials discover the philosopher general mostly in his laboratory, sometimes in his labyrinth. Nevertheless, extrusion of them as unauthorized is neither feasible nor desirable. In the remainder of this postscript, I propose to do no more than successively skim Althusser's autobiographies, his early works, texts from the Althusserian moment, and the late writings, before proceeding to a schematic periodization and tentative evaluation of the published work that seek to fix Althusser in his approximate limits. New section, partial recall. Within months of its release in April 1992, L'Avenir de long terme suivi les Défauts has sold 40,000 copies, attracting sustained attention in the French press. The longest book written by Althusser became the best-selling. The thinker who had endured a living death for the last decade of his life suddenly enjoyed a posthumous existence of sorts among an audience much of which had probably never heard of, let alone read the book's 4 marks in reading capital. Across the channel, coverage of the French original and its rapid translation focused predominantly on the sensational dimension of L'Affaire Althusser, the ritual monotony of the titles prefacing reviews. Quote, a Marxist murderer. Quote, sex, murder, and philosophy. Quote, Marx and murder. Quote, the Paris Strangler. Explains the space devoted by the mainstream press to the deceased adherent of an iniquitous doctrine, where, doubtless inadvertently, French commentators had sometimes given the impression that Althusser's murder of his wife weighed less heavily with them than his failure to abjure the God that failed. Their Anglo-American counterparts were readier to insinuate the equation fait divers equals fate philosophico-politique, or Marxism equals madness equals murder. Quote, I am one thing, my writings another, end quote, proclaimed Nietzsche in his putative autobiography. The point applies to Althusser. As to any other thinker, the genesis, the structure, the validity, and effectivity of a body of thought are analytically distinct issues for any inquiry that aims at something other than ad hominem incrimination or exculpation of ideas. At any rate, the secrets of Althusserian Marxism will not be exposed by inspection of its artisans' adolescent bedclothes. Quote, as a general rule, and quote, he once objected to Plekhanov's imprudent speculations on the causes of the French Revolution. Quote, concepts are not hidden in beds, end quote, Althusser. By way of variation on a Sartrean theme, it might simply be remarked, Louis Althusser became a manic-depressive murderer, no doubt about it, but not every manic-depressive murderer is Louis Althusser. The heuristic inadequacy of literary supplement psychobabble is contained in these 2 sentences. The first thing to note about the occasion of Althusser's renewed notoriety is that the status of both his texts is no less complex than their character. Les Faits, begun in 1976 but not completed, was scheduled for inclusion in a journal that never saw the light of day. L'Avenir de long terme, almost 4 times the length and characteristically drafted in feverish haste in the spring of 1985 between bouts of hospitalization, that was initially intended for publication but then simply laid aside. No will having been left by Althusser, his closest surviving relative, a nephew, became his executor and decided to authorize their release. Althusser's unavailing struggle against the psychological torment that preceded and punctuated his public career, the quote, war without memoirs or memorials, end quote, evoked in the article Freud and Lacan, was thus granted a memorial and yielded memoirs of a kind. But can the autobiographer's late tale of how he became what he was be trusted any more than Nietzsche's Ecce Homo? That there are reasonable grounds for doubt is suggested by nothing else, by the marked discrepancies between the book The Facts and the book The Future Lasts a Long Time. The former, under a typically laconic and ironic title, is composed in a comic register. It contains, for example, fictional encounters with Pope John the 23rd and General de Gaulle. The latter pertains to the converse mode, its tragic score unrelieved by the falsely optimistic note that strikes towards its conclusion. Essentially covering the same terrain, they do so quite differently, offering not so much a mutual corrective as alternative perspectives on Althusser's destiny. The effect of their appearance between the same covers is, or should be, to remind readers that autobiography is as much rhetoric as record, and hence art or artlessness, hiding art, a compromise formation between biographical, quote, facts and literary conventions. Where readings have not been flagrantly culpable, they have too often been ingenuous, in pre-Freudian fashion taking Althusser at his word, and therewith subscribing to, quote, an idea of reading which makes of written discourse the immediate transparency of the true, the real discourse of a voice, end quote. Althusser. The author of Reading Capital, insisted at the outset there is no such thing as an innocent reading. Althusser's own strategy vis-a-vis Marx, the, quote, symptomatic reading, end quote, that sought to reconstruct the latent structural matrix generating the manifest discourse of his text, was modeled on the Freudian interpretation of dreams. His analysis of the Althusser case and the reasons for his unreason, the tangled causal skein that issued in an act of destruction and self-destruction, requires an analogous operation. The occasionally oniric discourse of The Future Lasts a Long Time, the book The Future Lasts a Long Time, cries out for a symptomatic reading. It is immeasurably aided by Moulier-Boutang's meticulous reconstruction of Althusser's life up to 1956, which permits critical scrutiny of his own tendentious rendition. For there were many Althussers, of whom Althusser is only one who must be approached in consonance de cause. Yet the problem baldly stated, is that despite his biographer's endeavors, such knowledge is not at our disposal and is unlikely to be even when, if his second volume on the years 1956 to 90 finally materializes. The bare facts of what Althusser once dubbed as, quote, auto-heterobiographical circumstances are in the process of being established. The implacable logic of his unconscious remains recalcitrant to elucidation. Quote, nothing, Althusser justly remarked in one version of those, quote, facts from another seem, quote, could be more simple than the unconscious elements which analysis deals with, yet the combinations they assume in individual cases could not be more complex, end quote. Althusser. Because they appear under his signature, Althusser's own disconcerting simplicities were received as the disclosure of that individual combination in all its complexity, as if, contra Pascal's pensée, but in accordance with Descartes' discourse on method, the Althusserian heart had its reasons, and they were transparent to Althusser's head. Furthermore, his projection of the shadow of, quote, Althusser onto the younger Althusser, the construction of his own history in the, quote, future interior, has been accepted as the authoritative because authorized version. The book, The Future Lasts a Long Time, advertises itself as the public explanation which Althusser was at once excused and denied by the non-lieu, quote, no grounds, decreed after the murder of his wife, reminding us that there was an Althusser before and after, as well as during Althusserianism. The author stipulates that the book, The Future Lasts a Long Time, constitutes, quote, not a diary, not my memoirs, not an autobiography, end quote, Althusser, but rather what Althusser once described to his biographer as a, quote, trauma biography, end quote. He claimed to be, quote, sticking closely to the facts, end quote, but immediately adds a writer, quote, hallucinations are also facts, end quote. Althusser. We are dealing not with the tranquil recollection of a life lived, but the anguished retrospection of a death foretold. One which amply confirms Malraux's, Malraux's observation that what is tragic about death is death's transformation of life into destiny. In the words of its editors, the book, The Future Lasts a Long Time, is, quote, an inextricable tangle of, quote, facts and, quote, fantasies, end quote, Althusser. Or maybe not the editors of that book, not Althusser himself. Althusser seeks to situate his text by allusion to Foucault's edition of Pierre Vier's Testament and Rousseau's book Confessions. Other autobiographical writings that come to mind are Sartre's book Words and Schreber's book Memoirs of My Nervous Illness. In effect, this is a fragmentary, quote, wild self-analysis, end quote, something akin to the testimony of a Nietzsche and the language of a Freud. Just as, in a typical assertion of the singularity of the autobiographer, Althusser can lay claim to Rousseau's privilege and bane, quote, I am like no one in the whole world, end quote, so his confessions are exceptional, for better and worse alike. Much of their poignancy, as well as their ambivalence, derives from a fact so binding as to risk invisibility. The book, The Future Lasts a Long Time, is a symptom of the manic depressive syndrome that it hopes to exorcise through a public talking and writing cure. Its overture, replete with literary melodrama, is the crime scene. Following seeming self-detection, its envoy takes the form of the explanatory commentary of a, quote, old doctor friend, end quote, therewith in some measure reinstating the non-lieu, whose deleterious effects it hoped to conjure. The first half of the book is given over to the etiology, Aetiology, of its subject's mental illness in a, quote, family romance, end quote, played out in interwar Algeria and southern France, which soon acquires the contours of a familiar horror story. From his maternal aunt, Althusser learnt the family secret, that his mother's fiancé had been killed during the First World War, that she had subsequently accepted the marriage proposal of his brother, and that she had named her only son after the love of her youth and life. Once again, this is a paradigmatic instance of a standard feature of autobiography, minor antecedents entailing major consequences. At all events, thus informed, Althusser claims to have drawn a devastating conclusion. He had, so to speak, been born, not made, for inscribed in the infant Louis's first name was the true and other object of his mother's affections. Quote, above all, it contained the sound of the third-person pronoun, Lou, which deprived me of any personality of my own, summoning, as it did, an anonymous other. It referred to my uncle, the man who stood behind me. Lou was Louis. It was him my mother loved, not me, end quote, Althusser. As depicted by him, Althusser's mother is a mater dolorosa, straight out of the pages of de Beauvoir's Second Sex. Remembered as a violated wife, quote, a martyred mother, bleeding like a wound, end quote. Lucienne Althusser, née Berger, the maiden name to which she reverted after her husband's death, just as her son assumed it after 1980, is portrayed as a castrating mother, impelled by her phobias to enforce a strict regime of social and sexual, quote, hygiene on Althusser and his sister Georgette. From the domestic milieu in which her writ ran, his father was literally or metaphorically absent, inspiring in his son the sense that he had no father. The consequence, so Althusser claims, was a feeling of fathomless solitude, relieved only by his relationship with his maternal grandparents, quote, my true family, my only family, end quote, in the, quote, infant paradise, end quote, of the Bois de Boulogne overlooking Algiers, or of La Roche-Millet in the Morvan, to which they retired. As Althusser notes, the related themes of the, quote, fatherless child and, quote, solitude would recur in his philosophical writings. Chez la femme is the leitmotif of Althusser's case history. Quote, I fulfilled, bracket, my mother's, in bracket, wishes and expectations of the other Louis, and I did it in order to seduce her. I strove for goodness, purity of virtue, a pure intellect, a disembodied state, academic success, and to crown it all a, quote, literary, end quote, career. To accomplish this, I was to go to the École Normale Supérieure, not at Saint-Cloud, where Uncle Louis was to have gone, but the one in the Rue de Homme. Then I became the well-known intellectual who fiercely refused to, quote, dirty his hands, and, quote, in the media, and got my name on the cover of a few books which my mother proudly read, end quote, Althusser. Thus, to win his mother's love by fulfilling her desire was for Althusser simultaneously to realize his own being by fashioning an ego. The paradoxical effect of his project, as with its repetition in his relationship with his teachers, was to exacerbate the perceived original eccentricity. Seduction of others meant Althusser's seduction into his own betrayal. For, quote, I always had the impression I was not myself. I didn't really exist, and my existence depended solely on pretense. Indeed was a pretense, end quote, Althusser. In Revelations, onto which critics have latched, Althusser maintains that such, quote, depiction extended to his philosophical culture, or more precisely the lack of it. What is unquestionably true is that his formal education was interrupted after he had come sixth in the national examinations for admission to the Rue d'Homme. By the advent of war in September 1939, the political option current in the Catholic and monarchist circles in which he had moved at the Lycée du Parc in Lyon materialized at the collapse of the Third Republic. Among those sacrificed in the, quote, strange defeat, end quote, of June 1940 was Althusser. That the experience of captivity was a formative influence is clear. Notwithstanding the manifold privations it records, his accounts stress the redeeming features. While Sartre had never felt freer than under the occupation, Althusser enjoyed a sense of security in his prisoner of war camp. Accordingly, liberation in 1945 induced not elation but disorientation, betokening reversion to the solitude which enhanced that, quote, nostalgic desire for, quote, union, end quote, unquote, motivating subsequent attachments. Post-war, these attachments essentially reduced to three. The École Normale Supérieure, quote, a material ambiance, like an amniotic fluid, end quote. Althusser. But Althusser resumed his education and secured an academic post after being received second at the Philosophie Agrégation in 1948. Helene Reitman, Jewess, resistant, ex-communist fallen on hard times, who he met in 1946, and the French Communist Party, which he joined in November 1948. Helene's gift to Althusser, as he recalls it, was, quote, a world of solidarity and struggle, a world of reasoned action, a world of courage, end quote. Yet the prospect of redemption so miraculously opened up soon gave way to the threat of perdition. The relationship with Helene, 8 years his senior, was traumatic from the outset, so Althusser claims, plunging Althusser into a deep depression which necessitated the first of a score of hospitalizations following a diagnosis of schizophrenia. According to Althusser, he and Helene nevertheless performed an indispensable maternal and paternal function for one another. Helene was everything for which he had yearned. Quote, she loved me as a mother loves a child, and at the same time like a good father, in that she introduced me, to the real world, the vast arena I had never been able to enter, Through her desire for me, she also initiated me, into my role as a man, into my masculinity. She loved me as a woman loves a man, ! End quote. Althusser. Indissolubly linked to these rites of passage was Althusser's induction into the world of French communism, which he embraced, so he narrates, after the loss of his Roman Catholic faith. As the hopes borne by the resistance succumbed to the Cold War, and the, quote, united front of 1944 to 47 fractured into the, quote, two camps of 1948, Althusser chose his camp. Outside the party, no political salvation. Even without aggravating circumstances, the conjuncture would have proved inclement for the new academic recruit. Aggravating circumstances there were, however, in the form of Helene's exclusion from the party and Althusser's assumption of the mission to secure her readmission. So explosive an issue was this, that if no salvation was to be had outside the party, damnation beckoned within it. Althusser basically reiterates the standard account of the affair, attributing his wife's misfortunes to the malevolence of Elsa Troillet, and confirms the details supplied by one of the participants in it. Althusser sought to clear her name of having been a double agent. Of no benefit to her, his zeal served only to expose him to the censor of the Communist Party of France cell at the École for his dangerous liaison. Althusser maintains the experience induced a realistic appreciation of the Communist Party of France and its methods. According to Moullier-Botang, we know that the comparative equanimity with which he affects to have greeted the sanction of his comrades is belied by the historical record. Althusser maintains that the experience induced a realistic appreciation of the PCF and its methods. Thanks to Moullier-Botang, we know that the comparative equanimity with which he affects to have greeted the sanction of his comrades is belied by the historical record. In the book The Facts, reflecting on his imprisonment in Germany, Althusser recounts a plan which consisted in giving the camp guards to think that an escape had been effected, and then some 2 weeks later, when they failed to recapture the escapees, making the genuine attempt. For him it exemplified the, quote, nub of all philosophical as well as political and military problems, how to escape the circle while remaining within the circle, end quote. Althusser, having identified his attachments, the future is a long time. Oh, actually, it just says the future, so I might be missaying the title. The future turns into a tale of, quote, circle of circles, end quote. The family, the école, the relationship, the party, the clinic. And their mutual implication and overdetermination to produce a singular fate. Applying his own formula, it might be said that his narrative enacts his inability to find an exit from circles whose arc was inflected but not designed by him, and which degenerated from the seemingly virtuous to the intermittently vicious to the ultimately infernal. Thus, on his account, he and Helene formed a couple who by the end could live neither with nor without each other. What crystallized in Althusser's final harrowing image of November 1980 amounted to a, quote, private hell, end quote, terminated only by a murder in which, quote, self-destruction was symbolically achieved through the destruction of others, end quote. Althusser. As if an uncanny echo of Nietzsche's exaltation, quote, my time is not yet come, some are born posthumously, end quote. Nietzsche. The closing pages of the book The Future are leavened with a desperate optimism of the will, quote, so despite its dramas, life can still be beautiful. I am 67, and though it will soon all be over, I feel younger now than I have ever done, never having had any youth since no one loved me for myself. Yes, the future lasts a long time, end quote. Althusser. Perhaps, but not for the author of these lines. With ultimate pathos, what the text cannot know is that rather than registering the conquest of Althusser's illness, its conclusion betrays the manic phase of his manic-depressive cycle. Within weeks of its completion, hounded by the gutter press, he was back in hospital. Louis Althusser's time had come and gone. Most are not reborn posthumously. The overwhelming impression conveyed by the book, The Future Lasts a Long Time, is of Althusser's indivisible destructiveness and self-destructiveness. Mollier-Boutang's exhaustive research confirms that this propensity is mimed by the text itself in a consistent self-defamation which conceals a fact. Althusser was a man with qualities. Althusser's own express wish was that his testament would resolve his enigma. Excuse me, 1 second. Sorry, let me repeat that. Althusser's own wish was that his testament would resolve his enigma to public satisfaction, thus putting an end to demands for its explanation and releasing him into an emancipatory anonymity. In the event, its publication generated a further massive burst of a kind of voyeurism, attendant upon the events of 1980 to 81, for if not, the, quote, tissue of lies and half-truths, and, quote, bemoaned by one of his closest associates, it is, as Mollier-Boutang conclusively demonstrates, a rewriting of a life through the prism of its wreckage. Althusser's biographer has laid bare the profundity of his revisions in 6 main respects. First, and crucially, the inversion of the Althusserian family romance can be firmly dated to July 1964 and confidently attributed to none other than Helene Reitman. It was, in a letter of 26 of July 1964, who ventured the, quote, wild analysis, and, quote, of the familial dynamic as a fatality from the outset faithfully reproduced by her companion. Having, like Althusser's closest male friend in the 1950s, the suicide, Jacques Martin, endured a wretched childhood, Helene abetted Althusser in the projection of the manic-depressive shadow of maturity onto his infancy. Secondly, a central relationship in the young Althusser's existence is the underplayed and left largely unexamined. In his emplotment of his life story, his intense bond with his sister Georgette, whose own history of, quote, nervous illness, and, quote, tracked his own. Suffice it to indicate that some 2 weeks after receiving Helene's letter in the summer of 1964, Althusser had a dream about her that anticipates the murderous scenario of November 1980. Thirdly, Althusser postdates the onset of his recurrent depression to the post-war period, passing over in silence the trials he experienced both during his school days and then in captivity. The latter have, however, left their trace in the desolate record Althusser kept in Schleswig of what he called une vie sans histoire. One second. Where am I? Sorry. Where am I? 2 further contributions by Mollier-Boutang concern Althusser's relationship with Roman Catholicism and the controversy over Helene Reitman's resistance record. Regarding the former, it would appear that the pre-war activist in Jeunesse Chrétienne was politically considerably further to the right than he is prepared to concede in the future. More importantly, his gravitation to the left after the war involved no abrupt break with the faith of the church into which he was born. If the organization to which Althusser transferred his allegiances proved so recalcitrant to the rehabilitation of his companion, Mollier-Boutin gives us to understand it was because there was no smoke without fire. Postponing illumination of this obscure episode to his sequel, Mollier-Boutin meanwhile suggests that Althusser's claim in the book The Facts to have voted for Helene's exclusion from the peace movement amounts to a screen memory for the catastrophic breakdown he suffered after bowing to the will of his comrades at the École Normale. Finally, Mollier-Boutin's research in and of itself allows us definitively to reject Althusser's affectation, a la Wittgenstein, of ignorance of the history of philosophy in general and of Marxism in particular. This gesture of ingratiating self-deprecation or propitiation, foregrounding the unlettered genius capable of creation ex nihilo, rebounded on its author, being widely and gleefully construed by reviewers as exposing, in the words of one of them, quote, the philosopher emperor who had no clothes, end quote. In the course of a disappointing discussion of his, quote, road to Marx, end quote, and his relationship to Marxism, which admits the charge of, quote, imaginary Marxism, end quote, pressed by Romain Aron, Althusser fixes upon ne pas se raconter des histoires, not to tell stories, and not to tell ourselves stories, as, quote, the one and only definition of materialism, end quote. Here, at any rate, honoring his Machiavellian maxim more in the breach than the observance, self-imprisoned in what Sartre referred to as the, quote, retrospective illusion, end quote, of the autobiographical genre, Althusser tells himself and his readers more than one story, some of them tall. Rather than paving the way for subsequent volumes in the posthumous edition of Althusser's work and enabling an informed assessment of it, such stories were apt to queer their pitch. In turning to those volumes, we would do better to take Althusser not at his fabular, partial, retrospective word, but at his work. New section, Fateful Rendezvous. The same year as L'Avenir de long terme was published, which I think is The Future Lasts a Long Time, Althusser's Journal de Captivité appeared, which I guess is Journal of Captivity, or Captivity Journal, in a kind of testament of lost youth, or to the pitiless demarcation of generation, the, quote, terrible education of deeds, end quote, undergone by the pre-war royalist Roman Catholic found its muffled echo. The intrusion of, quote, historical problems in, quote, a life without history, the vacillation of faith rescued by resort to the wager of Althusser's constant companion Pascal, the volatilization of his politics reoriented towards communism by the counterexample of Vichy, that, quote, parade of counter-revolutionary France in which Nazi Germany took the salute, end quote. These helped induce the post-war, quote, intellectual in arms, end quote, summoned up in the preface to the book For Marx. Whatever his final destination, with the release in 1994 of a first volume of philosophical and political writings containing texts from 1946 to 51, it became possible to identify Althusser's post-war point of departure with some certainty. In short, it transpired that the intellectual, quote, biography of Marx outlined in the book For Marx and the book Reading Capital was something in the nature of an intellectual, quote, autobiography. The work of the mature Althusser conducted a tacit settlement of accounts with his own erstwhile philosophical consciousness. The critique of Hegelian Marxism conducted therein was, at the same time, a critique of the young Althusser. One result, as we read the early writings, is an intermittent sense of déjà lu. Not for nothing did Althusser remark in a review of Marx's newly translated Paris manuscripts in 1962, quote, even our own experience should remind us that it is possible to be, quote, communist without being, quote, Marxist, end quote, Althusser. The philosophico-political adventure recorded in them involves an intricately overlapping and cross-cutting transition from Catholicism to communism and from a variant of Hegelianism to a variety of Marxism. In their centerpiece, the 1947 master's thesis titled On Content in the Thought of G.W.F. Hegel, Althusser wrote, quote, Germany's political disarray made perhaps as deep an impression on the young Hegel as did the formalism of its religious life. Interestingly, it is only with difficulty that we can distinguish Althusser's political from his religious thought amongst the concerns of his early years. End quote. Althusser. With due alteration of detail, the observation applies to its author. Indeed, formal adhesion to the Communist Party of France in 1948 at the age of 30 coincided with maximum engagement in the activities of the Catholic group Jeunesse de l'Église, as if Althusser became a communist precisely because he was a Catholic. When a year later, no longer lapsing but lapsed, Althusser remonstrated with his ex-teacher, Jean Lacroix, quote, Jean Lacroix's, quote, personalist philosophy. He was keen to confide, quote, something I have experienced along with a number of your former students, end quote. Quote, namely, that in actively rallying to the working class, we've not only not repudiated what had been our reasons for living, but have liberated them by fully realizing them. The Christian I once was has in no way abjured his Christian, quote, values, but now I live them, whereas earlier I aspired to live them, end quote. Althusser. Quote, actively rallying to the working class, end quote. It is scarcely fortuitous if the diction of Althusser's Apologia was straight out of the lexicon of Gallic Stalinism. Footnote. In particular, the exhortations of the Politburo member responsible for intellectuals, Loren Casanova. End footnote. Like the young Marx under the German Confederation a century earlier, the young Althusser of the French Fourth Republic was immersed in the ideas of the age. Some of these respond by the, quote, return to Hegel, most prominently associated with Alexandre Kojève, prompting Jacques Derrida to react to Francis Fukuyama's re-edition of the, quote, end of history in the early 1990s by recalling that, quote, eschatological themes, were in the 50s, our daily bread, end quote. Jacques Derrida. Althusser's post-war native philosophical language was that of French Hegelianism, his ideological orientation akin to what the ex-communist Edgar Morin once dubbed, quote, Hegelo-Stalinism, end quote. It is also apparent, however, that at the height of the Cold War, Althusser shared the crude anti-Hegelian turn of Stalinist Marxism. What would seem to be the case that he never fully endorsed the impostures of Lysenkoism, the, quote, two sciences, bourgeois and proletarian, and did not succumb to the ferruginous romance of, quote, socialist realism, and, quote, Soviet boy and girl meet machine tractor station. He certainly did subscribe to Zhdanovism, party partisanship in philosophy, against which later claims for the autonomy of theory were staked. To borrow the terms of his letters to Lacroix, the quote, "philosophers' rendezvous with the railwaymen," end quote, proceeded under the sign of the Cold War in culture, appeared when the Communist Party of France was ranged against the Coca colonization of Fourth Republic France. Whatever their intrinsic worth, Althusser's early writings are redolent of a conjuncture of combatant philosophy in which the shade of Hegel was barely distinguishable from the specter of Stalin. Repatriated after 5 years of imprisonment, his religious faith intact but his political orientation upended by the infernal surprise of 1940, Althusser resumed his education at a moment memorably described by Ernest Gellner. Quote, "End of war and post-war France was like the human condition, but a damn sight more so. A damn sight more so. If ever there was a situation when men could not find reassurance for their identity, dignity, or conviction, this was it." End quote. Ernest Gellner, quoted in Rustin, 1996. As indicated by the earliest of the pre-war text, the article, "The International of Decent Feelings," published in 1946, or I don't know if it's published in 1946, but it says 1946 here. Althusser found reassurance in not heeding the ideology of the quote, "human condition," end quote, propagated by quote, "novelists turned prophets," end quote. Malraux, I don't know if I'm saying that right, Malraux, Camus, and Kustler, and co. Quote, "Anguish," Althusser wrote, quote, "is not the proletariat's lot. There is no emancipating oneself from the human condition. There is no emancipating oneself from the human condition. But it is possible to emancipate oneself from the worker's condition. It is possible to emancipate oneself from the worker's condition," unquote. Unlike, quote, "the false prophets of history," quote, "Marxists and their Christian or non-Christian allies," unquote, possess the sense of a redemptive ending. Quote, "The road to man's reconciliation with his destiny is essentially that of appropriation of the products of his labor, of what he creates in general, and of history as his creation. This reconciliation presupposes a transition from capitalism to socialism by way of the emancipation of the laboring proletariat, which can, through this act, rid not only itself, but also all humanity of contradiction," end quote. Althusser. The echo of Marx's early works, the proletariat as universal class," unquote, is resonant, and the Paris manuscripts positively invoked. However, in repudiating, quote, a, quote, "Western socialism without class struggle," unquote, a, quote, "system of protection against communism," unquote, Althusser was swayed by a certain Hegelianism, foregrounding a master-slave dialectic, that he not only undertook an intensive study of Hegel alongside Marx in these years, but was a Hegelian is evident from his master's thesis. If the article, "The International of Decent Feelings," was turned down by the journal for which it was intended on account of its virulent polemic, Althusser seemingly never sought to publish this remarkable document. Suggesting that post-Hegelian philosophy had not superseded Hegel, Althusser's text extravagantly displayed the historicist vices he would subsequently reprove in those who conflated the Marxist and Hegelian dialectics. Quote, "By way of history, Hegel's thought escapes the prison of a dawning age and the confines of a civil servant's mentality, offering itself to our gaze in the freedom of its realization and its objective development. In a sense, that is not un-Marxist. Our world has become philosophy, or more precisely, Hegel come to maturity now stands before us. It is indeed our world. The world has become Hegelian to the extent that Hegel was a truth, capable of becoming a world. We need only read. Fortunately, the letters are there before our eyes. Writ large in the text of history, letters become men." End quote. Althusser. Contemporary readers would have had no difficulty spelling out those letters, not the Emperor of Vienna, but the Generalissimo of Stalingrad. Hegel was indeed, quote, the last of the philosophers, end quote. Yet it was, quote, in the new slave of modern times, end quote, the proletariat, that the freedom prematurely announced by the phenomenology of spirit was in the process of being realized. Marx's imminent critique of the book, The Philosophy of Right, Hegel's Philosophy of Right, had demonstrated the contradictory nature of Hegel's perversely consistent benediction of the Prussian state in 1821, when actuality did not embody rationality. For all that, however, Marx had not surpassed Hegel, who represented his, quote, silent rigor, end quote. Quote, having denounced the alienation of the bourgeois world he lived in, and having merely predicted the end of alienation in the coming revolution, Marx was no more able than Hegel to leap over his time, and his own truths were recaptured by what they denounced. As philosopher, Marx was thus a prisoner of his times, and hence of Hegel, who had foreseen this captivity, end quote. Althusser, the Marxist conception of history, a materialist humanism irreducible to any natural or economic determinism, was, quote, thoroughly informed by Hegelian truth, end quote. Quote, for Marx, there is a positive side to capitalism, ... Without capitalism, without, that is, alienation in its extreme form, man would have succeeded neither in transforming his material powers into something universal, nor above all in reappropriating, through the brotherhood of man, the universality of his essential being. ... Capitalist alienation is the birth of humanity. We need not force the terms unduly in order to identify the fecundity of this division with the passion of Hegelian spirit, which does not go forth from itself by chance, but in order to appropriate its true nature, and which in this fall attains the revelation of a depth realized by the totality. The proletarian discovers the truth of humanity in the depths of human misery, end quote. Althusser, peppered with references to Kojève's book, Introduction to the Reading of Hegel, published as Althusser was preparing his thesis in autumn 1947, the article, On Content, is not a Kojèvian work. In a review of that volume written concurrently, Althusser reproached it for its unilateral anthropological interpretation of Hegelianism, which valorized subject at the expense of substance. The upshot was a, quote, existentialist Marx, and, quote, a travesty in which Marxists will not recognize their own, end quote. Althusser. So even Kojève was to be applauded for, quote, restoring part of Hegel's veritable grandeur, end quote. Althusser. Even as Althusser's notice was appearing, Andrei Zhdanov was laying down the line of, quote, two camps, bellicose imperialism / ironic socialism. At the inaugural meeting of the Common Forum and intimidating a conference of, quote, Soviet philosophical workers, and, quote, the question of Hegel was settled long ago. There is no reason whatsoever to pose it anew, end quote. Zhdanov. In 1950, an anonymous article, in fact penned by Althusser, was published in La Nouvelle Critique, a new PCF journal significantly subtitled Revue du Marxisme Militant, with Zhdanov's admonition as one of its epigraphs. Quote, the return to Hegel, the latest word in academic revisionism, noted the vogue for Hegel in France since the 1930s. Quote, the consecration followed. Hippolyte instated at the Sorbonne, Hegel recognized via his commentator as one of the masters of bourgeois thought, commentaries in the windows of all the bookshops, the, quote, labor of the negative, and, quote, in every term paper, master and slave in every academic talk, the struggle of one consciousness against another in Jean Lacroix, our theologians discoursing on the, quote, lesser logic, end quote, and all the to-do connected with the academic and religious jubilation over reviving a corpse, end quote. Althusser. Althusser had been compiling what he termed Hegelianaries, quote, Hegelianary, or, quote, Hegelian inanities, end quote. The, quote, Hegelian, quote, Robinsonade of master and slave, end quote, included, decried the pervasive recourse to Hegel's philosophy of history of the state. It served the needs of the, quote, moribund bourgeoisie, which had renounced liberalism in this, the crisis-ridden imperialist stage of capitalism. In particular, it validated, quote, the projects of reaction in France, end quote. Moreover, the Hegel revival tailored the revisions of Marx required to impugn communism. Impugn? I don't know how to say that word. How do you say that word? Impung? Impung? Sorry, I gotta look this up. This is gonna drive me crazy. It's one thing not knowing how to pronounce words in another language. It's another thing to not be able to do it in your primary language. That's not good.
Impugn.
Impugned. That's what I thought.
Impugn.
Okay. Moreover, the Hegel revival tailored the revisions of Marx required to impugn communism. Quote, the working class is recognized in the founder of the thought of scientific socialism, the theoretical weapon it needs for its liberation. Marxism is today the mode of thought of millions of human beings organized in communist parties throughout the world, a mode of thought that is triumphing in the socialist countries, the people's democracies, and the daily struggles of the working class and colonized peoples still subject to capitalist exploitation. In this mode of thought, it is the, quote, rational aspect of the dialectic that has been developed together with authentic knowledge of the material content of history. This knowledge points both in science and in the events inseparable from it to the inevitable collapse of the bourgeoisie and the victory of the working class, which will emancipate the whole human race. ... The time has come in which the overriding preoccupation of bourgeois philosophers and litterateurs is the following question. ... What does Marx have to be for the communists to be wrong? End quote. Althusser. Or end quote, Althusser. The question of Hegel had long since been resolved for the proletariat by the, quote, master of scientific socialism, end quote, who had rescued a revolutionary method from a reactionary system. By contrast, the bourgeois return to Hegel amounted to a, quote, revisionism of a fascist type. A, quote, revisionism of a fascist type, end quote. Althusser. Althusser's excoriation of modern, quote, irrationalism occasionally reads like a cruder miniature version of the monument to this ideological moment in the history of international communism, Lukash's book Destruction of Reason of 1953. An isolated incident, mercifully, it did not entail the destruction of his own. By now, all roads were perceived to lead either to Washington or to Moscow. On the 1st of July 1949, Pope Pius XII, whose record on fascism had been lamentable, issued a decree proscribing Catholics from association with communists and menacing resuscitants with sanctions. In that February, Althusser's article, A Matter of Fact, which featured in Cahiers de Jeunesse de l'Église, one of the main French groups targeted. There he reprehended the social doctrine of the Church, propounded in the papal encyclicals Rerum Novarum of 1891 and Quadragesimo. Anno 1931 as, quote, a form of reactionary reformism, end quote. As to its present political stance, quote, if we considered its policies on a global scale, we must admit that, apart from a few active but isolated small groups, the Church comprises ... an objective ... force that maintains a deep ... commitment to worldwide reaction and struggling alongside international capitalism against the forces of the working class and the advent of socialism, end quote. Althusser. Contrariwise, its future depended on, quote, the number and courage of those Christians who, are developing an awareness of the necessity of the struggle and joining the ranks of the world proletariat, The church will live thanks to those who, are once again discovering that the word was born among men and dwelt among them, and who are already preparing a humane place for it amongst men. End quote. Althusser. The July anathemas of the Holy Office resolved Althusser's, quote, matter of fact, and quote for him. Henceforth, it was not equally to Roman Catholicism, but exclusively to Soviet-style communism that he looked for salvation. The, quote, youth of the church, having been suppressed, the, quote, youth of the world, and, quote, Vaillant Couturier's characterization of communism, absorbed Althusser's energies. In an extraordinary 70-page letter to Lacroix, completed in January 1950, Althusser cited this phrase with the ardor of the convert. Part airing of grievances, part confession of faith, this epistle affords privileged access to the convictions and motivations of its author in his high Stalinist years. For a start, the latter partisan of a, quote, left critique of Stalinism, and, quote, entertained not the least doubt as to the legitimacy of the Reich show trial in Hungary in September 1949. Second, the former Hegelian dismissed, quote, the good old problem of the end of history and alienation, end quote, claiming that in Marx's residual use of the category, quote, alienation is an economic concept in the broad sense, end quote, Althusser. Third, a version of Vico's verum factum principle, held up to ridicule in the book Reply to John Lewis in 1973, was advocated. The proletariat knew the truth of history because it made history, proprio sensu. The historical materialism was a proletarian science. Finally, lauding Zhdanov's article on philosophy as, quote, a text admirable in every respect, end quote, Althusser extolled the, quote, extraordinary freedom, end quote, vouchsafed communist intellectuals in and through their conformity to the, quote, partisan positions, end quote, defined by the party. Their respective conditions of party and intellectuals were marked by a fundamental asymmetry, quote, I would like you to understand that the truth, is the iron law and condition of the party, and that we intellectuals perhaps do not always live in the same condition. The, quote, condition that is ours does not require us materially, as a question of life and death, to possess the truth, to put it to the test of struggle, to share it with other men. The, quote, we are not condemned to the truth. The, quote, condition that is ours does not require us, materially, as a question of life and death, to possess the truth, to put it to the test of struggle, to share it with other men, We are not condemned to the truth, end quote. Althusser. Hence the duty to, quote, show ourselves worthy of our admirable brothers, who are suffering and struggling for their freedom, for our freedom, end quote. Althusser. Hence the imperative of a, quote, rendezvous with the railway men, end quote, whose heroes of a resistance mythology, not devoid of all reality, impressed upon Althusser and his like, who were incessantly reminded of the railway man's rendezvous with the firing squad. Footnote, the fate, for example, of Pierre Simard, communist leader and secretary of the Railway Workers' Union, shot by the Nazis on the 7th of March, 1942. And footnote. Reflecting on the immediate post-war period in the book For Marx, Althusser observed that, quote, the intellectuals of petty bourgeois origin, and, quote, recruited by the Communist Party of France, quote, felt that they had to pay, the imaginary debt they thought they had contracted by not being proletarians. By not being proletarians, end quote. Althusser. I think that's in Reading Capital, because I've read this line before. End footnote. End quote. Even those, unlike Althusser, who had participated in the resistance were unquestionably made to feel it by an organization which, substituting itself for the class in whose name it spoke, impelled its intellectuals to self-abasement before la force tranquille of the proletariat, that is, itself, if for no other reason, Althusser necessarily missed his rendezvous. The preface to the book For Marx suggests that, quote, in his own way, Sartre provides us with an honest witness to this baptism of history, end quote. Adding, quote, we were of his race as well, end quote. Yet the vocation of the, quote, partisan philosopher, end quote, differed significantly from that of the, quote, committed intellectual, end quote. No ambivalence towards politics and power attached to those who, seeking to escape the, quote, intellectual condition, end quote, and contribute to the cause of human emancipation, submitted to the voluntary servitude of Communist Party discipline in the West after the Second World War. As regards that baptism of history, Althusser's early writings provide us with an honest witness. It is the less surprising that, when he reappeared on the public stage, forewarned and forearmed, Althusser advanced masked. Second. New section, selective affinities. Quote, I have, end quote, Althusser wrote to Lacan on the 26th of November 1963, quote, been pursuing obscure works on Marx for some 15 years. I finally slowly and laboriously emerged from the night. Things are clear to me now. That austere inquiry, that long and harsh gestation was needed, end quote. Althusser. By now, the inquiry went beyond Marx and it assumed a collective shape. Prior to the Reading Capital seminar of 1965, which consolidated and deployed their results, a sequence of seminars had been staged at the École Normale Supérieure. In the wake of Althusser's opening salvo on the subject, that of 1961 to 62 was devoted to the, quote, young Marx. The following academic year, coinciding with publication of Levi-Strauss's book, Savage Mind, and Foucault's book, Birth of the Clinic, attention switched to the article, Origins of Structuralism, with Althusser himself speaking on the article, Foucault and the Problematic of Origins, and the article, Levi-Strauss in Search of His Alleged Ancestors. At the time of the first exchange of letters with Lacan, Althusser and his pupils were engaged in a seminar titled Lacan and Psychoanalysis, during which Althusser wrote the article titled Freud and Lacan, carried by La Nouvelle Critique, the very Communist Party publication in which psychoanalysis had been anathematized as a, quote, reactionary ideology, in quote, 15 years before. The article, Freud and Lacan, has hitherto represented the sole published evidence of Althusser's own input into the joint enterprise of 1963 to 64, which saw contributions from, among others, Balibar, Michel Thor, Jacques-Alain Miller, and Yves Dureau. In the book Psychoanalyse et Sciences Humaines, we now have edited transcripts of the papers he presented. The first, titled The Place of Psychoanalysis in the Human Sciences, the second titled Psychoanalysis and Psychology, surveying the Gallic encounter with Freud. The former Althusser was concerned to demarcate Freudian theory from the, quote, philosophy of intersubjectivity, end quote, and hence from the Sartrean, quote, existential analysis that took its, quote, concrete bearings from Georges Politzer's book, Critique of the Foundations of Psychology, published in 1928. At the same time, he declined an anthropologization of Freudian concepts that effectively construed the superego as a latter-day, quote, pineal gland, joining biological individual and social collective. I believe the pineal gland is where, like, Descartes thought that, like, mind and matter came into contact. Anyway, this equally applied to the identification of psychoanalyst and shaman by Levi-Strauss, said to be, quote, becoming a specialist in the generalization of the pineal gland, end quote. Althusser. This equally applied to the identification of psychoanalyst and shaman. Lacan's, quote, methods of intellectual terrorism, end quote, on the other hand, were justified insofar as they were motivated by a, quote, radical refusal, end quote, of, quote, mechanistic or, quote, intersubjectivist distortions of psychoanalysis, serving a, quote, return to Freud and a theoretical interpretation of his texts, end quote. They thus facilitated specification of the, quote, de jure relationship, between psychoanalysis and the world of the human sciences, end quote. Quote, to penetrate this world, we need the point which Archimedes demanded in order to be able to see further, In my opinion, there are two anchorage points. One is the theoretical results of the problematic inaugurated by Marx, and the other is the possibility of a consistent, rigorous, and valid definition of psychoanalysis. This is what Lacan gives us, end quote. Althusser's second paper, full of allusions to Anna Freud and Melanie Klein, evinced antipathy to the discipline seemingly most proximate to psychoanalysis, psychology, whose credentials had been submitted to withering inspection in Georges Canguilhem's celebrated 1956 lecture titled, What is Psychology? Psychoanalysis had effected a, quote, epistemological break, end quote. It represented the, quote, eruption of a radically new discipline, end quote, with the, quote, potential to disrupt the field in which it erupts, end quote. Successive attempts at recuperation of it by its psychology, successive attempts at recuperation of psychoanalysis by psychology rested upon an identification of, quote, individual, quote, subject, and, quote, ego, typical of that discipline, which included the imaginary structure of the ego and irreducible alterity of the unconscious. Freud's revolution, quote, which you have restored, end quote, so Althusser flattered Lacan, entailed, quote, rejection of any homo psychologicus, end quote. Althusser. Meanwhile, against any absorption of psychoanalysis by biology, Althusser maintained that Freud's discovery revolved around the, quote, transition from the biological to the cultural, end quote, or the infant's entry into the, quote, symbolic order, end quote, via the, quote, defiles of the signifier, end quote. The leitmotif sounded in the seminar papers of 1963 to 64 resound in the, quote, culturalist interpretation advanced in the article Freud and Lacan, later acknowledged to be such by Althusser, with which the book, Writings on Psychoanalysis, opens. The remainder of the volume records the rise and fall of the alliance between Althusserian Marxism and Lacanian psychoanalysis institutionalized with Lacan's relocation of his own seminar to the École Normale in 1964 through Althusser's intermediation. Two themes are of special interest. The first is Althusser's counterposition of a, quote, logic of the eruption, end quote, to the problematic of, quote, origins, in conceptualizing the beginnings of a historical process. The term habitually employed by Althusser to describe the advent of both Marxism and Freudianism is surgissement, with its sense of, quote, sudden appearance, end quote, or, quote, springing up, end quote. Ben Brewster's otherwise excellent translation of the 1960s and 1970s tend to conceal this, since they invariably render the French by, quote, emergence, with its more genetic revolutionary connotations. In correspondence with his analyst René Diatkin, dating from 1966, in which Althusser sought to impress upon him Lacan's, quote, unique originality, end quote, the idiom of surgissement, felicitously translated as, quote, eruption by Geoffrey Melman, is frequent, contrary to the, quote, necessarily teleological, structure of any genesis, end quote, Both Freud's theory and its object, the unconscious, were to be conceived as the, quote, eruption of a new reality, end quote, something Althusser sought to clarify by reference to the, quote, eruption mechanism of a determinate mode of production, end quote. As analyzed by Balibar in the book Reading Capital, in the instance of the unconscious, Lacan's, quote, hypothesis that the structures of language, say of the symbolic, play a determining role in the mechanism issuing in its eruption, end quote, was upheld. The Lacanian simile, quote, the unconscious is structured like a language, end quote, meant that there could be, quote, no question of reducing the theory of the unconscious to a chapter or a subchapter of general linguistics, end quote. Althusser. This brings us to a second intriguing aspect of the Althusserian rapprochement with Lacan. The determination, vain as it happened, to obviate his assimilation to what Althusser disdained as the, quote, idealist aberrations of the, quote, structuralists, end quote, end quote. In a letter to Lacan of the 11th of July, 1966, a few months before his addresses écrits were collected. Second, sorry about this. This is plainly apparent from the article Three Notes on the Theory of Discourses, composed in the second half of 1966. These initiate a sequence of lengthy exchanges over the next 18 months among a group comprising Althusser, Balibar, Dureau, Tor, Pierre Machuret, and Alain Badiou, which Althusser hoped would lead to a collective article, Elements of Dialectical Materialism, a, quote, true work of philosophy that can stand as our ethics, end quote, as he put it in a letter to Balibar of the 14th of October, 1966. In the, quote, notes to hand, much taken up with the articulation of the unconscious and ideology, the structuralist pretension to unify the, quote, human sciences, end quote, via the linguistic model was met with a fin de non-recevoir by an Althusser insistent upon the differential singularity of the sciences. Lacanian reference to Saussure and Jacobson, Jacobson, fertile in itself, nevertheless indulged the illicit hegemonizing ambitions of structural linguistics as relayed by Levi-Strauss. The, quote, regional discipline of linguistics, whose object was the particular discourse known as langue, could function as a, quote, epistemological guide, end quote, for the missing, quote, general theory of discourses, end quote, to which psychoanalysis, whose object was the discourse of the unconscious, likewise pertained. Contrary to any linguistic, quote, formalism, however, it did not constitute that general theory, and psychoanalysis was misconceived as a subset of it, with a consequent dematerialization of Freudian theory. Quote, what really does expose us to the risk of, quote, losing the libido, end quote, is a mistaken conception of the object and thus of the claims of linguistics. If we interpret the phrase, quote, the quote, unconscious is structured like a language, end quote, as one which presupposes the deductive application of linguistics to an object called the unconscious, then we are indeed dealing with a formulation that is reductive of its specific object and with the loss of the libido. End quote. Althusser. Quote, so many questions, ... How can one answer them in the present state of affairs, end quote. Althusser inquired of his interlocutors at the end of his third note. But if, according to a letter of 1977, quote, every question does not necessarily imply an answer, end quote, a decade earlier, Althusser was confident that he had at least tabled some of the relevant questions, and as he informed the Société Française de Philosophie in February 1968, quote, humanity only finds an answer to the problems which it can pose, end quote. Indeed, in his November 1963 letter to Lacan, Althusser struck an evangelical note, quote, I am prophesying, but we have entered, in large measure thanks to you, into an era in which one can finally be a prophet in one's own country. I have no merit in running the risk of this prophecy. Henceforth, we have a right to it, since we possess the means for it, in this country, at last become ours, end quote. Althusser. The intervening years have more nearly vindicated St. Matthew. At time of writing, however, Althusser had published the majority of the articles his collection in 4 marks. In September 1965, propelled Althusser into the Parisian limelight, but not before they had aroused the political suspicion of his party. Days after communicating with Lacan, the text he enclosed with his letter, titled On the Materialist Dialectic, was the subject of a session of the Management Committee of La Pensée, presided over by Georges Cognot, co-founder of the journal and secretary to the communist leader Maurice Thorez. At a PCF Central Committee meeting the previous month on the Sino-Soviet split, Althusser's work had been criticized by Lucien Sèvres for Maoist inclinations, and rejoinders to the article Contradiction and Overdetermination of 1962 by party philosophers had taken Althusser to task on a variety of scores, from the Marx-Hegel relationship to the primacy of the economic. In a Bavura article, reply to a critique formulated in advance of the La Pensée confrontation on the 30th of November 1963, Althusser anticipated and repudiated his critics' objections. Although tacitly distancing himself from the political line of the Chinese Communist Party, he upheld the, quote, theoretical value, end quote, of the categories introduced by Mao's book On Contradiction. As to the complaint of, quote, dualism lodged by those who registered a culpable silence on the, quote, dialectics of nature, Althusser responded that since he lacked, quote, competence on the, quote, structures peculiar to natural processes, unquote, Althusser held his tongue on the subject. Quote, a scientist who has made a foolish remark, ... keeps quiet, often for some years for fear of making another. This is not generally the case in our philosophical domain, end quote. Althusser tartly rebuked his comrades. Quote, Althusserianism's paradox, end quote, Jacques Derrida reflected in 1989, quote, was that it claimed hardening and transformation simultaneously, ... but in both traits, ... it was playing to lose more and faster, end quote. Derrida. If, quote, Maoism afforded convenient shorthand for the political terms of that paradox, quote, structuralism is the appellation mal contrôlée for its theoretical terms. Seb's diagnosis of a structuralist, quote, contamination, giving moderate expression to a critical consensus overdue for revision. An astringent text of 1966 titled On Lévi-Strauss, penned shortly after Maurice Godelier's sketch of a Marxist structuralist synthesis in the book or the journal Aletheia, and circulated to Emmanuel Touré and others, reproved the, quote, functionalism, end quote, of the Lévi-Straussian social unconscious, the, quote, formalism of the structuralist combinatory, and the homologization of words, women, and goods consequent upon an abusive extrapolation of Saussureanism to non-linguistic objects, albeit that they were too, quote, hasty. Althusser reckoned that his criticism had located, quote, the precise point that distinguishes us from Lévi-Strauss himself, and a fortiori from all the, quote, structuralists, end quote, end quote. Althusser. That demarcation had been publicly signaled in a lecture titled The Philosophical Conjuncture and Marxist Theoretical Research before a packed auditorium at the École Normale in June 1966. The grandiose research program mapped by Althusser looked for domestic allies to the tradition of historical epistemology, Cavaillé, Bachelard, Coiré, and Canguilhem, and to Lacanian psychoanalysis rather than Lévi-Strauss, let alone, quote, fashionable Parisian ideological byproducts, end quote. Althusser. The structuralist fashion raised to fever pitch by two products of that year, Foucault's Les mots et les choses in April and Lacan's Écrit in November. Quote, imaginary Marxisms, end quote. Such was Raymond Aron's verdict on the Sartrean and Althusserian enterprises of the 1960s, conceded as we have seen by Althusser in the book The Future Lasts a Long Time and elsewhere. It, or rather Althusser's instrumentalist construal of it as a mere ruse de guerre, is disavowed by Balibar in the preface to the reedition of For Marx. What Althusser calls, quote, the quarrel of the, quote, real and, quote, imaginary Marxisms what he calls the, quote, quarrel of the, quote, real and, quote, imaginary Marxisms, end quote, triggered by the book For Marx, was intensified that November by reading Capital, where, to underscore Marx's putative rupture with the, quote, German ideology, Balibar himself ventured to describe historical materialism as, quote, a most unusual structuralism, end quote. Etienne Balibar. Most unusual because Althusserian affinities actually lay elsewhere, with Spinozism. The book For Marx may be regarded as the ante of the book History and Class Consciousness, translated into French in 1960. The book Reading Capital was more than an ante of the book Critique of Dialectical Reason by Sartre, published the same year. If the classification of their results is a, quote, imaginary Marxism, end quote, designed to turn the flank of the Communist Party of France leadership, is misleading, the, quote, return to Marx, end quote, of their self-conception is unilluminating. The motto in which the Royal Society spurned the authority of the past, nullius in verba, in the words of no one else, was not an option for Althusser, obliged by organizational allegiances to invoke the founder. Yet in doing so, he not only mounted a critique of, quote, historical, end quote, Marxism and communism, but also deployed Marx against himself, hence perhaps another paradox encapsulated by Sev. Quote, one of the most powerful Marxist thinkers of this century, was doubtless never exactly a Marxist, end quote. However, that might be, as the introduction to the 1996 reissue of Reading Capital makes clear, the 12 seminar sessions on Marx's Capital held in the Salle des Arts, I don't know if I'm saying that right, from January to April 1965, conjugated several different projects whose intertwinement counts for the richness of the published record. A, quote, critical rereading of Marx's scientific work, end quote. A, quote, recasting of the categories and figures of the dialectic, end quote, steered by the notion of, quote, structural causality, end quote, and intimately related to a reinterpretation of the basic concepts of Freudian psychoanalysis, an endeavor to substitute a problematic of, quote, theoretical practice, end quote, for the, quote, theory of knowledge, end quote, and a, quote, final project which subjectively at least governed all the others, end quote. Quote, the search for a communist politics, Spinoza's an inspiration, quote, theoretical anti-humanism, end quote, which would conceive communism as the becoming necessary of freedom, rather than as the, quote, exit from the kingdom of necessity, end quote. Althusser. In other words, the Althusserians' wholehearted conviction was that only theoretical anti-humanism in the present could orientate a practical humanism of the future. Whereas Althusser remarked around the same time of the painter Cremonini in a text fittingly reprinted in Volume 2 of Écrits philosophiques et politiques, quote, Cremonini, following the path which was opened up to men by the great revolutionary thinkers, theoreticians and politicians, the great materialist thinkers who understood that the freedom of men is not achieved by the complacency of its ideological recognition, but by knowledge of the laws of their slavery, and that the, quote, realization of their concrete individuality is achieved by the analysis and mastery of the abstract relations which govern them, end quote. Althusser. Several implications of Althusser and his colleagues' rereading of Marx's Capital, presenting their reconstruction of, quote, historical and dialectical materialism, end quote, as Marx's explicit or implicit construction of it, should be noted. First, Marx's opening up of the, quote, continent of history, end quote, to scientific exploration in Marx's Capital constituted a, quote, immense theoretical revolution, end quote, strictly analogous to the achievements of Galileo in physics or Lavoisier in chemistry. However, it had only been begun by him. He had founded a research program that remained to be developed, rather than promulgating a doctrine that need only be quoted by his successors. The second, inherent in Althusser's delimitation of historical materialism as an autonomous science with its own object, method, and theory, was renunciation of the, quote, materialist metaphysic inherited from the Second International by the Third, wherein Marxism was an autarkic cosmology, or, quote, worldview, subsuming the totality of natural and social phenomena, of which historical materialism was merely a subset. The third, in conjunction with Althusser's reassertion of the scientificity of Marxist theory, was an insistence upon its incompletion. not only as a result of the inevitable limitations of Marx's own contribution, but as a normal correlate of its scientific status. If it was to make good its claim to be a, quote, science among others, end quote, then by definition it must be capable of progression and self-rectification, producing the new knowledge characteristic of the quote, adventure of science in development, end quote. Finally, an inference from the Galilean analogy to this end, the problematic within which Marx had worked was open to recastings of the type being proposed by Althusser, in response to the misadventures of a science in stagnation, just as the science of physics, as opposed to phases in its history, was not designated by a proper noun, so too the science of history, quote, historical materialism, was not the property in perpetuity of a founding father. The, quote, theoretical contributions necessary for the present period, end quote, would, as Althusser tactfully but pointedly observed with reference to, quote, Leninism, quote, later be called by a name which does not exist as yet, end quote. Althusser, whether or not the name spelt, quote, Althusserianism, the import was clear. Insofar as they merely reiterated the Marxism of Marx, Marxists negated its scientificity, therewith abdicating their intellectual responsibility. Althusser's belief that the scientificity inherent in the non-humanist, as well as non-economistic and non-historicist bases of Marx's mature writings caused consternation within and without PCF ranks. At an assembly of communist philosophers in January 1966, which the main culprit could not attend because of illness, Roger Gouradi led the assault on the Althusserian reversal of alliances against theoretical humanism, sanctioned by the belief that nothing inhuman was alien to it, and repaid in kind by Machuret. 2 months later, the Communist Party Central Committee, while conceding freedom of research, resolved that, quote, Marxism is the humanism of our time, end quote. Althusser was undeterred by the ubiquitous accusations of l'humanité. Immediately after, for Marx and the book Reading Capital, Althusser set to work on an alternative manual of Marxism-Leninism to those available from Progress Publishers and or Éditions Sociales, from which extracts were published in the Maillissant organ of the Communist Students of the Rue de Homme the month after the Central Committee meeting at Argenteuil. In 1967, Althusser delivered a lecture course on Marx's The German Ideology, which started with an examination of Feuerbach, whose, quote, philosophical manifestos, and quote, of 1838 to 45 Althusser had translated in 1960, and whose book Essence of Christianity Althusser had published in the Theory series in 1968. In turn, Althusser envisaged incorporating this material, in which the secret of Feuerbachian anthropology resided in theology, into a work on the, quote, break, proposing to assume responsibility for the chapters on Feuerbach, the 1844 manuscripts, and the theses on Feuerbach, while Balibar took charge of the German ideology. An unfinished counter-polemic on the article The Humanist Controversy, in which Althusser demurred at his leader's pronouncements, traversed much of the relevant terrain. Scerazando a Scherzonde preface evoked Erich Fromm's commission, and then rejection of a text for an international symposium on humanism. The ensuing article, titled Marxism and Humanism, had elicited numerous critical responses in communist periodicals. In the book that I have on here on Praxis Marxism, they talk about this, about how Althusser tried to, or someone who the author thought was Althusser, tried to submit something that was rejected by the Praxis group. And it seems like that's being reaffirmed here. Whereas it had, quote, settled the question of early Marx's intellectual development with no ifs and or buts, in 2 lines, end quote, Althusser now scanned his evolution at some length, offering his most extensive discussion of the, quote, works of the break, end quote, and emphasizing the centrality of Marx and Engels, the centrality for Marx and Engels of Stirner's book, The Ego and Its Own. The, quote, notion of man, end quote, was a, quote, epistemological obstacle, end quote, to the science of history. In his mature works, quote, Marx starts out from the abstract and says so. This does not mean that for Marx, men, individuals, and their subjectivity have been expunged from real history. It means that the notions of man, etc., have been expunged from theory. For in theory, no one has yet, to my knowledge, met a flesh and blood man, only the notion of man. Far from being able to found and serve theory, these ideological notions have only one effect. They foreclose theory. These notions of theoretical humanism have been eliminated from Marx's scientific theory, and we have every right to eliminate them root and branch for the simple reason that they act only as, quote, epistemological obstacles, end quote, end quote, Althusser. Reaffirming Marx's theoretical anti-humanism, Althusser likewise asserted, quote, the anti-historicism, anti-evolutionism, and anti-structuralism of Marx's theory, end quote. But if Althusser was manifestly playing to win, Althusser was advised that it would be a long game. Quote, we are not laboring under any illusions. Theoretical humanism has a long and very, quote, bright future, end quote, ahead of it. We shall not have settled accounts with it by next spring, especially since next spring was May 68. Let me repeat that. We shall not have settled accounts with it by next spring, end quote, especially since next spring was May 68. The Paris Spring derailed the last major collective venture by the Althusserians, the, quote, philosophy course for scientists, end quote, staged in 1967 to 68. Althusser's own 5th lecture, anatomizing the, quote, invariant structure of the classical theory of knowledge, was published in 1995, thus completing the book Philosophy and the Spontaneous Philosophy of Sciences. Philosophy and the Spontaneous Philosophy of Scientists, published in 1974, or of 1974. While the course was underway, complimentary private exchanges with Badiou, Balibar, and Co. pondered the nature of philosophy, endeavoring to stabilize a, quote, politicist definition of it. In the midst of them, Althusser queried one of the central results of the symptomatic reading of Marx's Capital, advanced in 1965. Quote, I wonder if it might not be the case that what we regard as irrational residues in Marx's Capital, a discrepancy between the old categories and those that would be required by the new scientific problematic, that is, a certain anthropological Hegelianism, does not, quote, represent in Marx's Capital the, quote, philosophy heralded by Marx in the book Theses on Feuerbach, end quote. Althusser. This consideration would weigh heavily with the later Althusser, who might have subscribed to Derrida's detection of the, quote, coup de force of an artificial strategy, an interpretive violence, end quote, committed but not admitted in the book Reading Capital. The aftershocks of May were soon the order of the day. In 1965, Balibar had sought to infer, quote, elements for a theory of transition, end quote, from an analysis of the concept of reproduction. Post-May, Althusser embarked on a conjoint theory of reproduction and revolution. Significantly, however, only the first volume treating the former was substantially completed in March-April 1969, a second given over to, quote, class struggle and capitalist socialist formations. What the fuck? Significantly, however, only the first volume treating the former was substantially completed in March-April 1969, a second given over to, quote, class struggle and capitalist socialist formations, end quote, was seemingly never started. I don't know if that's supposed to say capitalist social formations or what, but I don't know. It's a weird title if that's actually the title. The article, The Reproduction of the Relations of Production, presented by Jacques Bidet, was finally published in 1995. It prompts three immediate observations. The first is that Althusser, aware that it can be a short step from fluency to facility, proved to be his own best editor in singling out the sections of the ideological state apparatus, the sections on the ideological state apparatuses and ideology in general for La Pensée in 1970. These represent his main contribution to historical materialism after 1965, albeit that in his 1966 critique of Levi-Straussian functionalism, he had drafted the script of his critics, who would argue that the attributes denied to human agency were transferred to social structures in Althusser's account of ideological state apparatuses. If the rest of the text adds nothing of enduring value to them, is largely because, second observation, echoes of the Cultural Revolution in China pervade this didactic exposition of the fundamentals of Althusserian Marxism-Leninism. Notwithstanding seriatim criticisms of then actually existing socialism, Althusser's political optimism was seemingly unbounded. Quote, we are entering an age which will witness the triumph of socialism the world over, end quote. Althusser. Contrariwise, and thirdly, anarcho-libertarianism, with its prioritization of, quote, repression and denigration of knowledge as authoritarian, was accurately identified as the proximate ideological beneficiary of the student revolt. In this respect, at least, May was, as Foucault surmised, quote, profoundly anti-Marxist, end quote. Of more immediate significance here, it was explicitly or implicitly anti-capital C communist, with decisive consequences for an Althusser trapped between the anvil of communist discipline and the hammer of ultra-leftist contestation. The intricacies of Althusser's transactions with the parties to the dispute cannot detain us here. Suffice it to say that they have invariably been discussed with a confidence in inverse proportion to competence, but that the contradictory pressures of the conjuncture post-May primed a series of, quote, auto-critiques, injecting ever greater doses of class struggle, des ex machina, redirecting structural causality, and debauching into a doctrine of philosophical correctness, whose concessions to critics issued in a, quote, bad return of the oppressed, end quote, is evident enough. Esprit des systèmes, esprit des contradictions, even as Althusser composed the most dogmatic of his, quote, rectifications. The book Reply to John Lewis of 1972, Althusser was privately parodying the, quote, laws of the dialectic, end quote, and his own promulgation of the theses of Marxist-Leninist philosophy, the quote theses of Marxist-Leninist philosophy, end quote, which looks like a title of a paper. Matters took a more serious turn in the mid-1970s with the anti-Marxist operation, quote, New Philosophy, end quote, in the wake of Solzhenitsyn's enormously influential book Gulag Archipelago. And soon enough, it was French Marxism in general and Althusserianism in particular that were experiencing a crisis. In an undelivered conference paper of 1976, published without his permission in 1983, Althusser retracted his ratification of Lacan. The following year, he proclaimed the, quote, crisis of Marxism, end quote, at a conference organized by Il Manifesto in Venice. Quote, the day of reckoning, end quote, had arrived. So a dejected letter of January 1978, to which Althusser attached his Venetian talk, confided to a Georgian friend. Quote, I see clear as day that what I did 15 years ago was to fabricate a little typically French justification and a neat little rationalism bolstered with a few references. Que vai es, Bachelard, Canguilhem, and beyond them, a bit of the Spinoza-Hegel tradition. For Marxism's, historical materialism's pretensions to being a science, I only half believed in it like anyone of, quote, sound mind, end quote, but the doubtful half had to be there so the other half could write, Not everything about this adventure was vain or worthless, but the question is how to, quote, manage this presumed or presumptive past in a situation like the one we're saddled with today. The only answer that I can find for the moment is silence. A silence that can become permanent. Why not? Or a step back in order to publish a few little things after all on Machiavelli, Gramsci and company, or a few impudent remarks on philosophy, an old idea that I've been carrying around with me for some time, or who knows, something on the Epicurean tradition. It's not much in a day and age in which one ought to be armed with enough concrete knowledge to be able to discuss matters such as the state, the economic crisis, organizations, the, quote, socialist countries, and so on. But I don't have that knowledge. Like Marx in 1852, I would have to, quote, begin again from the very beginning, end quote. But it's very late given my age, fatigue, lassitude, and so on, my isolation. Of course, there's also the possibility of returning to capital, now that we can pretty well see what doesn't work in its reasoning. Of course, there's also the possibility of returning to Marx's Capital, now that we can pretty well see what doesn't work in its reasoning, something it has to do with not the idea of the undertaking, but its arguments. Still, there too, if we want to be logical, it wouldn't be enough to take the mechanism apart. One would have to, quote, put it back together again, end quote. But that requires having other parts and something altogether different from the limited philosophical culture that I possess, end quote. Althusser. In an abortive manuscript from summer 1978, Marx dans ses limites, whose essential thrust is conveyed in the article Marxism Today, Althusser did address, even if he failed to resolve, the, quote, crisis of Marxism. Lashing out at André Glucksmann, Levy, and the like, Althusser nevertheless called for a, quote, labor of correction and revision, end quote, of the Marxism of Marx, Lenin, and Gramsci. By then, the electoral Eads of March 1978 had tolled the knell of the phase of French politics opened by May 68, provoking the frontal assault on the Communist Party leadership in Le Monde, with which Althusser's public career came to an effective end. As we now know, however, Althusser did not cease to think and write in the interval between the murder of his wife and his own death 10 years later. Stepping back, as Althusser had anticipated in his letter to Merab Mamardashvili, he did indeed return to the quote, Epicurean tradition, end quote, and Machiavelli. I'm assuming this is his Georgian friend that was mentioned earlier, because Mamar Dashvili is definitely, I'm pretty sure that's definitely a Georgian name. I can't remember Stalin's born last name, but it's definitely something like that. And Stalin is Georgian. New section. Section 5, Brief Encounters. Sorry for that dead air. The extremely uneven, often fragmentary materials associated with the late Althusser can be divided into two groups. 1. The late writings proper. The article, The Underground Current of the Materialism of the Encounter, drafted in 1982. The article, Philosophy and Marxism, constructed between 1984 and 1987, but also drawing on Althusser's 1976 Spanish talk, titled The Transformation of Philosophy. The book, The Future Lasts a Long Time, contrived in 1985, and 3 chapters on Spinoza, Machiavelli, and the, quote, political situation, end quote, originally intended for the book The Future Lasts a Long Time, but ultimately omitted from it. And 2, Machiavelli and Us, a set of lectures given in 1972, revised on and off in accordance with the idiom of the late Althusser up until 1986 or thereabouts, and carefully polished for posthumous publication. The first group of texts in the freight of generic references and misquotations revolves around the postulate of what Althusser calls a, quote, aleatory materialism, or, quote, materialism of the encounter, end quote, supposedly originating with Epicurus and variously continued by Machiavelli, Hobbes, Pascal, Spinoza, Rousseau, Marx, Heidegger, Wittgenstein, and Derrida. This, quote, authentic materialism, end quote, is positively contrasted with an incorrigible, quote, dialectical materialism, derived as a, quote, yellow logarithm. Quote, my principal thesis, Althusser writes in the article The Underground Current, quote, is the existence of an almost completely unknown materialist tradition in the history of philosophy, a materialism of the encounter. The existence of an almost completely unknown materialist tradition in the history of philosophy, a materialism of the encounter, and therefore of the aleatory and of contingency. This materialism is opposed as a wholly different mode of thought to the various materialisms on record, including that widely ascribed to Marx, Engels, and Lenin, which, like every other materialism in the rationalist tradition, is a materialism of necessity and teleology, i.e. a transformed, disguised form of idealism, end quote. Althusser. The article, Philosophy and Marxism, affords a fuller version of the same capsule definition. Quote, my intention here is to insist on the existence of a materialist tradition that has not been recognized by the history of philosophy, that of Democritus, Epicurus, Machiavelli, Hobbes, Rousseau, the Rousseau of the Second Discourse, Marx and Heidegger, together with the categories that they defended, the void, the limit, the margin, the absence of a center, the displacement of the center to the margin and vice versa, and freedom. A materialism of the encounter of contingency, in some of the aleatory, which is opposed even to the materialisms that have been recognized as such, including that commonly attributed to Marx, Engels, and Lenin, which, like every other materialism of the rationalist tradition, is a materialism of necessity and teleology, i.e. a disguised form of idealism, end quote. Althusser. And thus isolating anti-finalism as the defining characteristic of any consequent, quote, materialism, the late Althusser was resuming the Spinoza's critique of Hegelian teleology, encapsulated in the category of a, quote, process without a subject or goals, end quote. Althusser. No, that quote actually is not from Althusser. That's from a secondary source. That's from Kalinikos, 1995. Acknowledged not to be, quote, a Marxist philosophy, quote, aleatory materialism is proposed as a potential, quote, philosophy for Marxism, end quote, one to which Marx himself was only ambiguously affiliated, for, quote, constrained to think within a horizon torn between the aleatory of the encounter and the necessity of the revolution, end quote. Althusser. As André Tossell has written in a fine essay, Althusser no longer, quote, looks exclusively to Marx for the philosophy supposedly contained, quote, in the practical state, end quote, in Marx's Capital, in his theory of the capitalist mode of production and its structural causality, and which allegedly refutes reference to Hegel's teleological logic. This theory is itself now subject to critique as the product of a persistent metaphysical rationalism and purged of what bound it to the principle of reason. The critique is conducted via the themes of the materialism of the underground current of the encounter, a new philosophy developed independently of Marx by Epicurus, Machiavelli, Spinoza, Rousseau, and Heidegger, which has become the norm of the critique of Marx's idealist rationalism, end quote. André Tossell. Pierre Raymond's severe estimate of the, quote, very approximate, end quote, character of what Althusser himself called the, quote, intuitions of the article The Underground Current and the article Philosophy and Marxism are difficult to gainsay. Quote, Althusser accumulates some very different philosophical sources, and heterogeneous themes, which he never analyzes distinctly or precisely. End quote. Pierre Raymond. As it were, Epicurus, Machiavelli, Spinoza, Marx, and a host of others, mem combat. I'll know what that means. In a heroic exercise in fine-grained exegesis of these convoluted texts, to which readers are referred, Zuchting, I don't know, WALS SUCHTING, while pinpointing numerous inconsistencies and obscurities, plausibly distills a methodological, quote, anti-necessitarianism rather than a traditional philosophical indeterminism from them. Less perplexing is Althusser's sustained analysis of Machiavelli, which confirms the soundness of Emmanuel Thoray's judgment prior to the publication of the book Machiavelli and Us, that there was little or nothing fortuitous about the encounter between the secretaries of the Florentine Signoria and the Parisian Grande École. In the book, The Future Lasts a Long Time, Althusser characterizes Spinoza as a, quote, nominalist, commenting, quote, Marx taught me that nominalism was the royal road to materialism, end quote. Althusser. And in response to Navarro invoking Wittgenstein's, quote, the world is what the case is, end quote, he isolates the, quote, fundamental thesis, end quote, of nominalism as the existence exclusively of singular, quote, cases, situations, things, totally distinct from one another, end quote. Althusser. Althusser's Machiavelli is a nominalist in the stipulated sense, frequently admired as a secular theoretician of politics, as commonly belabored as the cynical technician of power. Machiavelli, so Althusser argues in the article the underground current had a quite different order of achievement to his credit. Quote, a philosophical theory of the encounter between future and virtu. VIRTU with almost like a backwards accent on top of it. End quote. Althusser indicated his intention to elaborate on these, quote, brief notes. Nothing with Althusser ever being simple, however. In fact, he already had as early as 1972 in his book Machiavelli and Us. Althusser's text started life as a course for candidates of the philosophy agrégation at the École Normale in January-February 1972. Around 1975 to 76, Althusser significantly revised it, especially the introduction, gave it its present title, and wrote a preface, having summarized its conclusions in a lecture on, quote, Machiavelli's Solitude, which is also a title. In 1977, Althusser then returned to the book Machiavelli and Us, in Althusser's final decade, systematically replacing references to the, quote, dialectic and, quote, dialectical materialism, end quote, by the discourse of, quote, aleatory materialism, end quote. In his intellectual biography of Machiavelli, Quentin Skinner maintains that, quote, in order to understand Machiavelli's doctrines, we need to begin by recovering the problems he evidently saw himself confronting, end quote. Quentin Skinner. Althusser, too, was intent upon a recovery of Machiavelli's problems, the better to displace perennial controversies over the Florentine diplomat, for example, whether he was the founder of positive, quote, political science, and reveal him instead as what, transposing Negri's characterization of Spinoza, we might name, quote, the savage anomaly, end quote. For Althusser, Machiavelli does not merely criticize the Renaissance humanism rooted in classical antiquity. In pursuit of la vérité effectuelle de la cosa, he unequivocally repudiates it, together with, quote, the entire tradition of Christian theology and all the political theories of antiquity, end quote. The upshot is, quote, Machiavelli's solitude, end quote. Stranded as Machiavelli is between classical and Christian traditions on the one hand, and the modern tradition of natural law theory on the other. As Timothy O'Hagan has remarked, quote, if Althusser's Machiavelli is solitary, his reading of Machiavelli is not, end quote. Timothy O'Hagan. Foreshadowed by Hegel in 1802, elaborated by De Sanctis in 1870, and adopted by Gramsci in the 1930s, according to it, the overriding, quote, problem posed to and by Machiavelli is, quote, the constitution of Italian national unity, end quote. Althusser shares this sense of the Machiavellian problematic and correlative conception of the prince as a, quote, revolutionary manifesto, end quote. The real novelty of Althusser's interpretation lies elsewhere. It hones in on Machiavelli's dispositif théorique and its effects on the, quote, modality of his object, end quote, as the key to his philosophical importance. The peculiarity of this dispositif is that it states a series of general theses on history, which are literally contradictory, yet organized in such a way as to generate concepts not deducible from them for the purposes of theorizing a, quote, object which is in fact a determinate objective. Quote, object which is in fact a determinate objective. End quote. Althusser. Machiavelli's object is not some theory of the, quote, laws of history or politics, but the conjunctural conditions for the foundation of a new principality. Machiavelli's, quote, endeavor to think the conditions of possibility of an impossible task, to think the unthinkable, end quote, induces, quote, a strange vacillation in the traditional philosophical status of Machiavelli's theoretical propositions, as if they were undermined by a different instance from the one that produces them, the instance of political practice, end quote. Althusser, inscribing in itself the place of the political practice that can alone determine the identity of, quote, a new prince in a new principality, end quote. Machiavelli's theory of the conjuncture inhabits the space of the putatively universal, the abstract theoretical, to think the irreducibly singular, the concrete historical case of 16th century Italy. If, quote, the first theorist of the conjuncture, end quote, can specify the conditions for a fruitful encounter between virtue, or the political agency of the prince, and fortuna, or the contingency of the real, his grasp of the necessity of contingency precludes any prediction of what is by definition aleatory. Consequently, quote, Machiavelli is not in the least utopian. Machiavelli simply thinks the conjunctural case of the thing, and goes diretto alla verità effettuale della cosa. He asserts it in concepts which are philosophical and no doubt make him, in his temerity, solitude, and scorn for the philosophies of the tradition, the greatest materialist philosopher in history, the equal of Spinoza, who declared him, quote, acutismus, end quote, Althusser. Where the, quote, early writings shed light on the pre-Althusserian terminus a quo, in short, Catholicism and Hegelianism, the late texts table the question of the post-Althusserian terminus ad quem. Is Antonio Negri right to posit what, alluding to Althusser's, quote, turn, Negri has dubbed, quote, Althusser's care? That's Kehre. I don't know what that means. Is the last Althusser radically distinct from Althusser's earlier philosophical selves, or are these discernible and demonstrable elements of continuity as well as discontinuity between them, elements that might in turn necessitate a rereading of the overly familiar Althusser of the 1960s and 1970s and a more nuanced delineation of him at the zenith of his celebrity? One second. Where am I? Sorry about that. As the original date of composition of the book Machiavelli and Us might predispose us to think, an answer in the affirmative to the second question is indicated. Althusser, unrehearsed, contains references to themes and authors already present in the mature Althusserian discourse on method before taking center stage in the closing meditations on a philosophy for Marxism. It might even be argued that the principal merit of the article, The Underground Current, and related texts is that they facilitate a litmus test on the Althusser of the 1960s and 1970s, indicating underlying themes across his work. In his valuable lexicon of the late Althusser, Vittorio Morfino detects, quote, the presence of various themes that indicate a strong continuity with the works of the 1960s, end quote. 1. The concept of process without a subject, and hence the negation of any form, whether internal or external, of teleology. 2. The primacy of relations over related elements. 3. Theoretical anti-humanism. 4. The claim that philosophy has no object. 5. The definition of the structure of metaphysics according to the schema origin, subject, object, truth, end, foundation. These constitute the rational core of, quote, aleatory materialism, and yet terminological discontinuities, harboring conceptual continuities, are invariably couched in sometimes confusing, quote, new constellation of terms, end quote. 1. Void/nothing. 2. Encounter. 3. Fact/factum, FAKTUM/factual/facticity. 4. Conjuncture/conjunction. 5. Necessity/contingency. Indeed, if one theme explicitly formulated as such runs like a red thread throughout Althusser's work, then it is the, quote, necessity of contingency, end quote, aimed at surmounting what the book Reading Capital identified as the, quote, classical opposition, necessity/contingency, end quote. Quote, cornerstone, end quote, as Morfino notes, quote, not only of the late Althusser but also of the earlier one, end quote. It postulates that, quote, instead of thinking contingency as a modality of necessity or an exception to it, we must think necessity as the becoming necessary of the encounter of contingents. Mentioned only in passing in the article The Underground Current, it is probably to Antoine Augustin Cournot's definition of chance events as the unpredictable but intelligible consequence of the encounter of independent causal series that we owe the category of, quote, necessary contingency, end quote. Introduced by Cournot by Jean Guitton at the Lycée du Parc from 1936, Althusser invoked him sparingly but approvingly in the 1960s, most strikingly in an unpublished working note from 1966 that reads like an outline for the article The Underground Current. Quote, 1. Theory of encounter or conjunction, parenthesis, equal genesis, end parenthesis, cf. Epicurus, Kahneman, Cournot, and parenthesis, chance, etc., precipitation, coagulation. 2. Theory of the conjuncture, parenthesis, equals structure, and parenthesis, philosophy is general theory of the conjuncture, parenthesis, equal to conjunction, and parenthesis, end quote. Althusser. Or at least that's a quote, I'm not sure. It says, the footnote under this quote says, quoted in Althusser 1997. Anyway, moving on. There's a footnote, also a footnote that I missed. Quote, in a famous definition, I believe this quote's from Althusser. It is. Yeah, it is. Quote, in a famous definition, bracket Cournot, and bracket, declared chance events to be those that were produced by the encounter of two independent causal series. Since the universe was not the outcome of a single natural law, but was plainly governed by a variety of different mechanisms, there were both processes governed by more or less linear causal sequences, occurrences set off by intersections between them. This was the difference between what was regular and what was random, each equally intelligible. The contrast, for example, between the movement of planets and meteors, or of tides and glaciers. The innovation of his philosophy of history was to be what he called a quote, not a quote, it's in italics, an aetiology, Aetiologgy, a systematic inquiry into the weave of causes that compose the fabric of history. The task of such an inquiry was to trace out the complicated patterns of chance and necessity that had shaped human development by distinguishing between threads of, quote, independence and, quote, solidarity within its causal continuum. And footnote. As Francois Mitterrand has argued, the category of the, quote, encounter is not some, quote, belated discovery of Althusser's. It constitutes one of the fundamental tendencies of the articles collected in the book For Marx. It is posited in all the texts whose object is the conjuncture, and which seek to show what it means to think theoretically from the standpoint of a task to be accomplished, rather than from the angle of the fait accompli. End quote. Francois Mitterrand. Shortly after referring to Cournot, parenthesis, quote, c'est grand maisonneux, end quote, end parenthesis. The underground current article itself peters out with a contrast between two conceptions of mode of production in Marx, one, quote, historico-aleatory, end quote, the other, quote, teleological, referring back to Balibar's genealogy of the capitalist mode of production in the book Reading Capital, while regretting that Marx himself succumbed to the second. Minus the critical note, however, the project of an alternative logic of the constitution and transformation of modes of production, characterized as a, quote, theory of the encounter, end quote, or, quote, conjunction, end quote, in an unpublished letter of 1966, recurs in Althusser's work. In the article, The Humanist Controversy, for example, we read, quote, capitalism is the result of a process that does not take the form of a genesis. A process that does not take the form of a genesis. The result of what? Marx tells us several times of the process of an encounter of several distinct, definite, indispensable elements engendered in the previous historical process by different genealogies that are independent of each other and can, moreover, be traced back to several possible, quote, origins, ... To put it plainly, capitalism is not the result of a genesis that can be traced back to the feudal mode of production as if to its origin. It is the result of a complex process that produces, at a given moment, the encounter of a number of elements susceptible of ... constituting it in their very encounter. End quote. Althusser. the humanist controversy. As intimated by Terray, Terray, in a remarkable text predating publication of the late writings, what else in retrospect was Althusser's Philosophical Manifesto of 1962, the article Contradiction and Overdetermination, but the adumbration of something like a theory of the necessary contingency of history, prioritizing conjuncture and conjunction over structure. Neither a transcription of historical necessity nor a ratification of historical accident. On Althusserian premises, revolution is the applicable exception that proves the implacable rule, because the exception is the rule. The exception is the rule. The, quote, materialism of singularity, end quote, imputed to the trio of Machiavelli, Spinoza, and Marx, but perfected in the work of the first, underwent magnification in the mirror of Machiavelli after 1980. In a letter sent to Franco Madonia while at work on the book Reading Capital, Althusser critically adjudged Gramsci, quote, the Machiavelli of modern times, end quote, remarking that, quote, Gramsci reads Lenin through Machiavelli, just as Gramsci reads Machiavelli through Lenin, end quote. Althusser. Mutatis mutandis, does the last Althusser invite an altogether dissimilar verdict? Rather than essay and answer, I shall table some further questions and proposals for research prompted by the late Althusser. The first is this. Is Balibar right to perceive a recurrent tension in Althusser between the Leninist / Machiavellian analyst of the singularity of conjunctures and the structuralist Marxist theorist of invariant structures? Between, one might say, the article Contradiction and Overdetermination and the article on the materialist dialectic, or even between the books For Marx and the book Reading Capital? And if this is the case, does the option for, quote, aleatory materialism, and quote, not so much resolve as dissolve it? Second, is there a precedent of sort for his position in non-Marxist Anglophone philosophy of history, more particularly in the work of J.T. Bury, who seems to have drawn upon Cournot for his concept of history as a, quote, chapter of accidents, end quote. For example, in the essay titled Cleopatra's Nose, whose starting point is Pascal's famous observation that, quote, if it had been shorter, the whole face of the world would have been different, end quote. Pascal. If so, is Althusserian aleatorism altogether distinct from a certain common-sense empiricism among British historians captured in H.A.L. Fisher's oft-quoted view of history as, quote, the interplay of the contingent and the unforeseen? Quote, the interplay of the contingent and the unforeseen, end quote. H.A.L. Fisher. Or alternatively, is it closer to George Sorel's concern with the, quote, logic of contingency, end quote, rendering the French Marxist thinker brusquely dismissed in the book For Marx a possible native, quote, precursor, end quote. Finally, with Althusser's late writing on necessity and contingency, are we not present at the strangest of encounters, however brief? Quote, our whole age, end quote, Foucault once pronounced, quote, is trying to escape Hegel, but any real escape, presupposes, that we know what is still Hegelian in that which allows us to think against Hegel, and that we can assess the extent to which our appeal against Hegel is perhaps one more of the rules he employs against us, end quote. Foucault, insofar as the internal link between necessity and contingency is a Hegelian postulate, was, quote, aleatory materialism, the ultimate ruse of Hegelian reason, and what are we to make of the irony of intellectual history that the last Althusser, erstwhile author of a dissertation on Hegel, had staged a return to the youngest Marx, sometime author of a doctorate on Democritus and Epicurus? New section, section 6. The Day of Reckoning, Althusser and His Limits. Any future intellectual biographer of Althusser will have to bear in mind his stricture in the article on the young Marx as to, quote, the necessity and contingency of Marx's beginning, end quote. Or in the introduction to Reading Capital, where Marx renounces, quote, every teleology of reason. Where Althusser, Jesus Christ, Althusser renounces, quote, every teleology of reason, urging a reconceptualization of, quote, the historical relation between a, bracket, theoretical and bracket, result, and its conditions of existence as a relation of production, and therefore as what, in a phrase that clashes with the classical system of categories, we can call it the necessity of its contingency. The necessity of its contingency, end quote. Althusser, or again in the book Elements of Self-Criticism, when revisiting Marx's, quote, epistemological break, Althusser asserts that every science is, quote, born out of the unpredictable, incredibly complex and paradoxical, but in its contingency necessary conjunction of ideological, political, scientific, philosophical, and other, quote, elements, end quote, Althusser, Elements of Self-Criticism. In short, he or she will have to be guided by the maxim that contingency is the mother of invention, and make a virtue of it, permitting readers, quote, to witness in an emerging life, once the gods of origin and goals have been dethroned, the birth of necessity, end quote, Althusser. Pending such a venture, having completed our rapid tour of the posthumous edition of Althusser's writings, we are now in a position to mimic the operation he performed on Marx with this crucial difference, that the object of the exercise is not to locate an epistemological discontinuity, whether between the young Althusser and the mature Althusser, or middle Althusser and late Althusser, but to indicate conceptual discontinuities, and therewith bring out any conceptual continuity or continuities. Accordingly, employing Althusser's own idiom and risking the wrath of adepts of the, quote, narcissism of small differences, end quote, we can suggest the following approximate periodization of Althusser's published works. 1. 1945 to 50, the early works. 1950 to 59, the works of the break. 3. 1960 to 1975, the mature works. 4. 1976 to 1978, the transitional works. 5. 1979 to 1986, the late works. 1. The period of the early works is the pre-Althusserian phase of the writings collected in English as the Spectre of Hegel. Though the book Spectre of Hegel and Stalin might have been more apt, if less palatable title, As we have seen, they trace a dual nonlinear transition from Catholicism to communism and from left Hegelianism to what Althusser himself would later characterize as the, quote, poor man's Hegelianism, end quote, of Stalinist Marxism. 2. Quote, works of the break can serve as a catch-all for Althusser's exiguous, heterogeneous output of the 1950s, ranging from the two decidedly anti-Hegelian texts on Marxism of 1953 to the splendid short book on Montesquieu of 1959, a decade in which Althusser abandoned the ideological formation of his youth without explicitly settling accounts with it. 3. The mature works of 1960 to 75 must be subdivided into two moments. A. The, quote, rationalist movement of 1960 to 66, or the articles and seminar papers assembled in the book For Marx and Reading Capital. This moment of the elaboration of, quote, structural Marxism, end quote, under the auspices of the quote, theory of theoretical practice, end quote, is one in which, for hostile critics, Althusser's stance resembles that of the Wilhelmine bureaucracy, whose mindset could allegedly be summed up thus: that's all very well in practice, but does it work in theory? Insofar as Althusser came to confess to, quote, theoreticism as the mortal sin of these years, Althusser read his work through the eyes of those critics. This catalyzed a second moment of the mature works. B. The, quote, politicist moment of 1967 to 75, represented in texts such as From Philosophy on the Spontaneous, represented in text from the book Philosophy and the Spontaneous Philosophy of the Scientist of 1967, through to Essays in Self-Criticism 1973 to 75. This moment of the unavailing autocritique and rectification of Althusserianism involves a new definition of philosophy as, quote, class struggle in theory, end quote. Whatever the revisions of structural Marxism, it pertains to the same period. The mature works, because of the ongoing unqualified insistence on the scientificity of Marxism, indeed of Marxism-Leninism, and the conviction that it inheres in the non-economistic, non-historicist, non-humanist, and so forth bases of Marx's own mature works. 4. Around 1976, a new period begins, which is one not of the auto-critique, but of the auto-deconstruction, even self-destruction of Althusserianism, and the radical problematization of the scientificity of Marxism itself. It is most dramatically attested to in the talk of 1977, The Crisis of Marxism, and the 1978 encyclopedia article, Marxism Today, text whose content overlaps with that of the abandoned manuscript on Marx and His Limits, which is a title of an article. Writing of a break, they can also be regarded as in some sense transitional works, paving the way for a final period of Althusserian production. 5. The fragmentary late works of the 1980s, soon to be available in English as the book Philosophy of the Encounter, open a new intentionally reconstructive phase in which various Althusserian constants are cast in the non-Marxian and non-Marxist currency of, quote, aleatory materialism. Less a radical change of direction than an inflection, the key innovation of this period is a retraction, the non-attribution of Althusser's own constructions to Marx himself. Indeed, quite the reverse, their deployment against Marx and his successors. In other words, quote, aleatory materialism, end quote, may be regarded as the continuation by other means of Althusser's abiding project from the 1960s onward. The deconstruction of historical Marxism, or the ideological orthodoxy of capital C communism, and the reconstruction of historical materialism, and in its anti-finalist Althusserian rendition. Historical materialism was all along to extend his own category to be a theory of history as a process without an origin, a subject, a center, or goals. A process without an origin, a subject, a center, or goals. One second. The tentative assessment promised at the outset of this postscript can take its bearings from the privative character of that formula, process without an origin, a subject, and so on, and the negative character of the corresponding polemical slogans, anti-historicism, anti-humanism, anti-essentialism, and so forth. In sum, Althusser's achievement, still substantial enough, in all conscience, was a primarily negative one, successively deconstructing historical materialism in the 1960s, and then his own full-scale alternative to it in the 70s, but failing to replace them, whether in the 60s, 70s, or 80s, with a positive alternative. Hence, not only do the late writings not represent as radical a departure from the books For Marx and Reading Capital as superficial acquaintance might suggest, but they do not mark a genuine advance over them, a fortiori, since their rational kernel, quote, materialism of the encounter, end quote, for short, the hub without the hubbub, so to speak, is extractable from the mystical shell, quote, structuralism for convenience sake, in those great works. Therein, to recapitulate, Althusser launched an assault on aspects of the Stalinist legacy in the context of an attack on forms of an intentional. Therein, to recapitulate, Althusser launched an assault on aspects of the Stalinist legacy in the context of an attack on forms of intentionally anti-Stalinist Marxism, deemed incapable of furnishing the requisite theoretical resources with which to sustain a consistent political opposition to Stalinism from the left and put history back on the tracks of human emancipation from economic exploitation, political oppression, and ideological domination. Indeed, Althusser subjected virtually the whole of formerly existing Marxism to swingeing criticism on the grounds that, notwithstanding the obvious differences between its representatives, they all performed variations on Hegelian themes. For what were habitually construed as the mutually antipathetic traditions of Orthodox and Western Marxism exhibited the common vice of, quote, historicism, the, quote, economism typical of the Kautskiist Second International and the Stalinist Third International, and the, quote, humanism characteristic of recurrent reactions against it, such as Lukács in the 1920s or Schaff in the 1960s. Both these broad tendencies amounted to secularized versions of a Hegelian theodicy, depicting human history as an expressive normative totality possessed of an origin, a center, a subject, and a goal. Economism, a, quote, poor man's Hegelianism, end quote, constituted a technological determinism, plotting a meta-narrative of the inexorable progress of the productive forces in a fixed linear sequence of modes of production, from primitive communism via antiquity, feudalism, and capitalism to advanced communism. Its ineluctable advent in a, quote, negation of the negation, end quote, executed by the proletariat would mark humanity's leap from the, quote, kingdom of necessity, end quote, to the, quote, realm of freedom, end quote. In seductive yet deceptive contrast, humanism, a, quote, rich man's evolutionism, end quote, Althusser, secreted a teleological philosophical anthropology, projecting an odyssey of the human essence, divided against itself in the forms of class society that culminated in the capitalist present, only to be reappropriated under the classless community of the communist future. Its realization by the revolutionary praxis of the universal class would consummate humanity's rites of passage from the condition of alienation to the, quote, end of history, end quote. The scandal of the Althusserian anatomy of these seemingly antithetical interpretations of Marxism consisted in his identification of them and their political correlates, quote, mechanism and, quote, voluntarism, as mere images, not in their diverse inspiration or aspiration, but in their theoretical schematism and historical messianism. This homology, traceable to a common Hegelian ancestry, allowed for a degree of amalgamation of the two, as in Althusser's own early writings, but the humanist inversion of Hegel conducted by Feuerbach and adopted by the young Marx, and the economistic inversion of Hegel, perpetrated by the Second International and bequeathed to the Third, preserved a historicist philosophical structure, even as they reconjugated its elements. Thus, despite the hostility of Cold War Stalinism to Hegel, inscribed in it, Althusser argued, was a Hegelianization of Marxism, whereby the phenomenal forms of ideology and politics function as the ruses of economic reason. Consequently, historical materialism assumed the shape of what Marx had dismissed in 1877 as, quote, a general historico-philosophical theory, the supreme virtue of which consists in being superhistorical, end quote. Marx. Althusser's objections to any such theoretical, quote, reductionism were simultaneously analytical and political, insofar as it abstracted from the constitutive complexity and specificity of historical conjunctures, it was explanatorily impotent before the, quote, implacable test of the facts, end quote, of modern history, whose revolutionary events, Russia in 1917, and non-events, Germany 1918 to 1919, had obstinately declined to comply with its predictions. It thereby precluded a precondition of rational political practice, a defining characteristic of, quote, scientific, as opposed to, quote, utopian, socialism, the, quote, concrete analysis, and, quote, indispensable to the real comprehension and hence potential transformation of, quote, concrete situations, end quote. Geared to a reformation of communism via a renovation of historical materialism, the veritable intellectual operation launched in a plenum by a self-professed, quote, political agitator in philosophy, end quote, who aspired to be the Luther of the one and the Newton of the other, was obliged to proceed as if it were restoring the authentic tradition. One second. Where the hell am I? Of more non-Marxological moment than its textually tendentious character, however, is the discrepancy between the cogency of Althusser's critiques of classical and post-classical Marxism and the vulnerability of his counter-constructions. This has invariably been explained by his complicity with the 1960s Parisian cult of impersonality, or, quote, structuralism. As demonstrated above, however, Althusser was at pains to dissociate himself from the French ideology, and it is primarily to Spinoza that we should look for the key to the originality and fragility of Althusserianism in its reconceptualization of the dialectic, reconfiguration of the structure of social formations, and retheorization of ideology. Whatever the, quote, sources of Althusserianism, its, quote, component parts, and, quote, proved on inspection to be flawed in ways that permitted their destruction at Althusser's own hands or those of others. 1. Its, quote, anti-empiricism. for example, by an unstable compromise between rationalism and conventionalism, seeding perspectivist or realist rejections. 2. It's, quote, anti-humanism, by a paradoxically historicist dissolution of human nature and repetition of the structure/agency dichotomy, tilting the theorization of ideology in a functionalist direction. Three, it's, quote, anti-historicism by its institution of a theory/history antinomy, emphasizing social reproduction while rendering social transformation inscrutable. 4, and it's, quote, anti-economism by an elliptical resolution of the base/superstructure conundrum via the volatile category of, quote, relative autonomy, end quote. Above all, while Althusser's treatises on the emendation of the Marxist intellect took deadly aim at such articles of faith as the end of history and the end of ideology, or the inevitability, transparency, and ultimate harmony of communism, they left others of science, class, party, and state substantially intact. Moreover, in pairing Lenin and Mao as the antidote to the young Marx, Stalin, and Khrushchev, they erected an imaginary Leninism and Maoism which, when put to the question, did not survive the ordeal of what Trotsky once called the, quote, merciless laboratory of history, end quote. The decline in Althusser's public powers after 1968 was, of course, overdetermined by another case, history. Even so, there is no mistaking his loss of direction mid the series of defeats suffered by the European left in the 1970s. From Portugal to France, which put the seal on hopes for an alternative to Soviet or Chinese, quote, real socialism, and led to general decline in the reputation of Marxism among Western intellectuals. The net effect was to impart to Althusser a highly paradoxical historical significance such that he may be regarded not only as the focus of the last truly international, impassioned debate in Marxist philosophy, but as one of the leading protagonists in two decisive episodes in post-war French thought. The first was the anti-existentialist and more broadly anti-phenomenological turn of the 1960s, concerted under the umbrella term of, quote, structuralism. Althusser's distinctiveness within it was to advocate a rearticulation of Marxist philosophy and communist politics as the basis for answers to the burning questions of the politico-philosophical conjuncture. In so doing, he repudiated the available models of the compliant party ideologue and independent committed intellectual. As to his answers, Alistair MacIntyre's aforecited verdict may stand, quote, so far as French philosophy was concerned, he de-Stalinized Marxism more thoroughly than any other Marxist did, end quote. MacIntyre. Yet to the extent that he did but failed to establish a viable substitute, a common deduction was that Althusser had proved the unsustainability of any version of Marxism. Thus it was that the self-declared partisan of a, quote, return to Marx, end quote, became the inadvertent artisan of the turn from Marx associated with, quote, post-structuralism. For by virtue of the contradictory complexity of his Marxism, the transfer of allegiances could proceed via an anti-Marxist radicalization of certain of his theses. To conclude, thus to fix Althusser in his limits is to recognize the limitations of the, quote, imaginary Marxism, end quote, with which he sought to supplant the, quote, Hegelo-Stalinism, end quote, Althusser had subscribed to at the beginning of his career, to register its essentially destructive charge in spirit and substance alike, to record the self-evident failure of its ambition, which subjectively and objectively governed everything else, to renew communist politics, and thereby just this once giving him the last word, stifle any inclination to tell ourselves stories, even or especially, about Louis Althusser. And that's the end of Althusser, the Detour of Theory by Gregory Elliot. Thank you so much for listening.